So we are now going to call the meeting to order at 11:20 a.m. Can I get a roll call? Mr.
Good morning, everybody. Mr.
Morning.
Ochapinti,
Here.
Mr. Lee.
Here.
Oh, I hear echoes. Mr. Hada,
Here.
Mrs. Ann Garrett,
Present. Good morning, Candace.
and Miss Salahuddin.
Here, thank you. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda unless there are any changes?
So moved. Second.
All of in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, great. I believe we don't have any public comment. Nope. All right, turning it on over to Nicole and Deborah. Thanks.
All right, good morning, Board of Trustees and our student trustees, welcome. Thank you for joining, all of the staff and partners. Good to see you all. I'm just honored to hang out with you. Deborah and I are always excited to come hang out with Jefferson, as you know. We were talking this morning, just saying this is such a great group to work with because where they are in their journey just is amazing, right? And while we have a long ways to go, we just appreciate and are inspired as we work with boards, not just around California, but around the nation in terms of where you are. And even in the transition, again, Tony, congratulations on taking the helm as the new superintendent. I think that's really an amazing thing. And what's awesome is you've been a part of this journey, Tony. So that's the good thing, right? You're not coming in as a brand new superintendent, which, it's not a bad thing either. But reality is that when you've been there and you've been rolling up your sleeves and part of the hard work on this journey, is powerful. So we're just excited this morning to just support you all on moving forward and next steps. There's going to be always lots of non-closure because this is a journey and this stuff doesn't happen overnight. And ultimately, our goal today is to stay focused on governance, right, with an equity lens, and how to move yourself on that journey, and collectively leveraging some of the resources and partnerships that you have as well. So as Tony shared in the Google folder, there are several documents that we're going to reference today. And in our agenda, you may or may not have it in front of you, not a big deal right now, but I'm going to walk you through a couple of things prior to jumping into your equity statement. I'm going to go into some content time today, where we're going to talk about not only your priorities around equity work, but then what are some of the barriers that are going to get in the way that we need to be aware of, and what is some of the professional learning that your staff needs to have to get to be able to implement all this vision that you have as a governance team. And then, of course, we'll spend some time going through your equity policy and looking at some revisions and looking at how do you want to use that document to drive your governance. And then we'll talk about next steps at the end in terms of where you can go with creating a plan of action, which is always exciting as well. One thing that we will do, if you did not have a chance to read through the article, Racial Equity Detours, if you didn't get a chance to read through it, we're going to actually give you some time to look at it. So don't stress about that if you didn't have a chance to go through it. Because we know you're busy folks, but definitely know it's an important connection to what we're going to talk about with policy. So before I jump in, I know I always like to make sure that you all have any updates or announcements about the work since we saw you last. So is there anything that you would like to share before we jump in, just to give context for where we're going today? I know the community watching, obviously, they haven't been at the last study session. They may not, know what we're even talking about. Like, what are they talking about today? So do you want to give a little context? I don't know, Kalima, because I know you have to jump in and out doing the testing today. So do you want to just give a little context about where you all have been, where we're going? Any updates that are helpful for the board today, and if anyone else wants to jump in to add, that'd be great. But I wanted to just give you all that opportunity.
Sure. So it's been a long process, but it's been extremely meaningful and impactful to me, the process and the professional development that I personally have gone through to really understand, the term equity, right? Especially right now, equity is used like every 2 seconds. Like everybody's talking about how equitable they are right now. But what does that truly mean? And more importantly, what that means for Jefferson Union High School District. And so we all know where the gaps are. Like that's not a big surprise to anybody if we talk about where we're not successful with certain students in relation to um, historic and systemic oppression and marginalization of different communities. We kind of know where our gaps are. The struggle has been, how do we go about helping and supporting all of our students in a way that that really values the student, one, and two, in a way that's the most beneficial to them, instead of what I've been used to in the 9 years I've been a school board member, and even longer as a parent. We just have one way we're doing something for foster kids, and we have one way that we're doing something for this, and it's not, and it's usually the way that's most beneficial for us, and it doesn't take into account the community or the student at all. And also the different things and hurdles and et cetera that they bring with them. So how do we change mindsets so that we have a more opening and community-based school that's reflective of the students that are in the school, and that is really about the students and their education and less about our own comfort and doing what we've always done to this day. I mean, that's kind of the reason why I'm here and why I'm glad that we're all committed to the work.
Powerful. Thank you, Kalima. Appreciate that context. Really helpful. Does anybody else want to add to what Kalima shared before we jump in and get started? Go ahead, Nick. Jump in.
Yeah, not to repeat anything that President Salahuddin was mentioning, because I think the equity work is everywhere. It's being talked about in enough places where I feel like that in itself is a step, because we know based off the election results, Propositions 15 and 16 spoke largely to equity and fighting for that in terms of quantitative funding, just basic resources that we're going to be missing if we don't run something else. And then, of course, affirmative action and looking at equity in plain civil rights language. And so there's a lot to be said in terms of where the narrative is. And like, Kalima was saying, that a lot of people are talking about it, but where do we get to the next step? And looking at the readings today, I think we'll get into it. Within our district, I want to say that it's been really empowering to see our students and faculty and staff and admin and just our community as a whole step up through this pandemic to address both COVID itself, as a pandemic, and of course, what we're seeing even counties, create some kind of legislative precedent for addressing it as racism as a pandemic as well. Mm-hmm. If that's where we really are as a county and as a state and as a country, and then I think we should be moving on that with, as many people are saying now, more than just talk, with more action. And so people are ready for that. And that's what days like this come down to is where's our plan, and how can we empower those who want to plan to start planning and moving forward and creating that structure behind the agency, which is our community. So I'll leave it there and pass it to the other trustees.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. Powerful. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Anybody else want to add? Anybody else want to add in just kind of why we're here, and of course, a little context for where we're going today. But I think those reflections are really powerful to remind us why we're here. Yeah, jump in, Andy.
Yep, just real quickly, I think, it's fun to see both you, Nicole, and Deborah in particular, since, we've been on this journey together now this is the third year of my journey with you, and what I've learned. And so it's nice to finally be in a place now where we've taken the concepts from the network and to make it local, and the fact that we've come this far to be able to actually have these kinds of discussions and to really take to internalize it with our district and to make it impactful to our students. So it's wonderful to see you both, and I look forward to today's session.
Yeah, powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Andy. Thanks for the reminder. It's been, we're on the third year. It's crazy how fast that time went, and it is exciting to see it evolve. Yeah. Powerful. Go ahead, Tony. Yep.
So I just want to add to the conversation that thank you for acknowledging me at the beginning. And one of probably the main reason why I'm so excited to be leading this district is that the Board of Trustees values equity and this work that we're doing, because this is work that's been very important to me for many, many years. And so I'm just thrilled about that. And I just also want to say that I'm really glad that, you know, here you see it's not only board members or the superintendent, but it's, you know, our union. It's Tiffany working with all of us from Circle Up. It's our students that are here on a Saturday. So I'm really excited for the day and building on the work that we've already done.
Powerful, powerful. Thank you. All right. If anyone else has any comments, jump right in. If not, we can jump into the day. You ready? All right. So here's what I'm going to do. Just appreciate that reminder about the work. And what I'm going to do is share my screen. Share the right screen. It's getting there. There it is. And it disappeared. And it's thinking. There it is. All right. So in your Google folder, you have, I placed the slides that we're going to reference today. And they are simply, several of them are slides you've already seen, but most of them are just graphic kind of visual representation of the work we're going to do today. But Deborah and I always like to begin with, you know, reminding us of why we're here in terms of our roles as facilitators in pushing you to be able to continuously raise your hand, like those images on the right, that your hand stays up for all three of these questions, right? Like you want change, absolutely. You want to change, right? Which means we want to be reflective. What can we do differently? And kind of looking at the mirror, in the mirror, saying, what is our role in this change? But also that last one, who wants to lead the change? And keeping our hands up even for that question, because that's where this work gets really hard and it stops, is when we have to lead it, and specifically leading when some people don't agree with this work. Some people don't understand, when our personal core values get challenged in this work, right? When we have crossroads, we have to make decisions that we fear we may lose our job, or we fear we may be you know, criticized in public. I mean, there's all these different things that come out of leading this type of work when you're interrupting a system. As Nick said, you know, we're battling not only a pandemic based on health reasons around this virus, but we're battling a pandemic around racism. And the reality is racism has harmed everybody. And so what happens when we start interrupting racism, everyone hasn't quite understood what that means. And so there's fear, right? There's emotions, there's anger, there's all these things that come with it. So we want to make sure as you jump in today that you think about, how do we take this work deeper and recognize some of the barriers that are going to come our way when we do this great work, okay? Because this is where, as facilitators, Deborah and I really want to be here for you, because that's where it's easy to say we want to change, and it's not easy to say I want to change, but it definitely is a process that nobody can get in the way of except for ourselves, right? We have to look internally. But now when you start to have to do something about it, that's where the work is really hard, and we want to make sure your work sustains itself. So one of the things that's really difficult in moving forward is making sure we always ensure there is safe space for us to engage in this work together. And not just with this governance team. I think Deborah and I both agree, like there's a lot of safety within your own group, right? Even there's moments that you don't agree with each other, or you all may be in a different space on your journey, but there's this level of safety, meaning we all have a place in this work. I have not experienced any of you in a place where you're like, okay, I'm attacked because of my ethnicity or my gender or my identity, right? Like that's important. And that's, you know, people should always feel like no matter where I come from, that I have a place in this journey. I'm not judged or attacked, right? But then there's this place where we're like, okay, we got to move from safety to being brave and do something. And that's where the discomfort comes in. So we want to remind you about the 4 agreements that we share every single time. We do not skip this step, because this is the place where, as governance teams, because you're a public body, right, and people get to see you do your work publicly, that it sometimes can feel unsafe as well. But we do push you, especially during this time where there's a lot of energy. I think Nick said it, like everybody's kind of doing this work all over the place, right? But I tell you, what I'm finding is that people are starting to confuse safety and comfort. And so this is why I want to bring this up, is that you need to have safe space for your teachers, for your students, your parents, to be able to engage. But we do have to remind people that there are going to be moments where we're going to feel uncomfortable. And those are two different things. And that's what I want you as a governance team to be thinking about as you go deeper into this work, is each time that you start to unpack levels of this work, you're going to have the community push back. You're going to have people who aren't going to agree. You're going to have people who are uncomfortable and pressure you to stop this work, right? This is too much. We're not ready for this. Like, that's offensive to that part of the community, or that group doesn't understand, or, I mean, you're going to have a lot of different things that come up. So we just want to remember, safety and comfort are two different things. And that's what you're going to have to really grow as a governance team, and really looking at calling that out, even when you're having those moments where people are saying, I don't like this, right? When privilege is interrupted, and we're going to unpack that with what does privilege mean, right? Privilege is just simply a way of saying, like, we have power and we have the ability to basically say, stop. Right? Where many don't have privilege, right? So when they're offended or they feel uncomfortable, they don't have the power to say stop. That's the difference. And so as a governance team, you naturally, as leaders, you naturally have privilege, right? This is not about white privilege. This is not about anything but positional privilege right now, right? And positional privilege, when it gets uncomfortable, it can say stop. It can disengage. So I want you to be thinking about that, because this is going to come up numerous times. We're going to feel like, oh, I'm not safe right now. It's like, no, you're safe. You're not going to lose your job. You're not going to have anybody go in and hurt you physically, right? At most, your feelings might get hurt. And that's more of a sense of discomfort, because it might be something that's different from your truth, right? Your experiences. So this is the thing we got to wrestle with today. So I want you to be thinking about that. And also just keep this in mind as you're practicing safe space. Think about what your teachers are going to need, right? Your staff is going to need when you start to say, hey, we have these policies and expectations. Now we're going to expect our staff to do the same thing. Remember, they need safe space to move forward in this work too. That's going to be really important. And I've been preaching about this a lot in the last couple of weeks for a reason, because the energy after Mr. George Floyd's murder was very high, right? Lots of people want change. But when it was time to start saying, okay, who wants to change? That's when people started to go, are you sure? Like organizations, right? Are putting out statements and everything. And then it's like, okay, let's start looking at your practices. Let's examine them. And then when we start exposing things, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, let's back up. That's not safe. No, it's very safe, but it's uncomfortable. So I want to make sure that we practice that today, and really recognize that now that George Floyd energy has started to come down, and now we're starting to see some things, people aren't always as ready as they think they are. So just be mindful of that. As equity leaders, we're going to meet them where they are, recognize that, handle with careful gloves, but we're going to carefully pull you along and remind you that it is okay to be uncomfortable, because this is where you're going to grow. So before I go into the deeper part of our work, I want to ask you as a governance team, what is it you think you need, and what do you think people even need for a space to be safe for them? What is it that is needed? I think it's important to think about. So just unmute yourself and just kind of jump in. What do you think is needed for safe space to exist? I'll stop sharing so we all can see. What is needed for safe space to exist? And so I gave one example, like people not being attacked, right? Like literally not personally attacking someone. I think that's important. So think about what is needed for safe space to exist in this type of work, especially as a governance team where this is public work, right? Public. Jump in.
I think speaking of jumping in and jumping out. So, those of us who are comfortable speaking, speak up, but then take a step back so that people that are not as comfortable to speak. I'm always one of the first people to jump in, but then I sometimes say, no, I'm going to let 5 people speak before I say something. And so practicing that is, and I didn't do it this time, but next time I will.
But Monica, tell us more about why that's important. Because I think, what you're saying is like, I think about people having equal airtime, right? And not always having the same dominant voice. So, but tell us more about what that means in terms of safety, because I think what you shared is important.
Well, because people, they're the first time you hear an idea from a different person, might be, it's like if you hear it, if you and I both have the same idea, but I'm always speaking first, and I don't, you don't get a chance to be the first one to say it, then it doesn't get heard the same way. I might be thinking of some different ideas other than safety, but I just feel like it's a way to let the people that are not as comfortable or do not have a voice.
Got it.
Have a voice. And even I practice this in my own meetings. I've said to some of my members, sometimes maybe you should text that idea to this person and let that person say that idea. Even if it's your idea, let them say it and grow their power and grow their voice.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you for that. That's powerful.
I realize we're allowed to jump in. I was like raising my hand. I also think that, especially as we're sitting here working on equity, I think that just being aware when we have privilege and when we feel sort of entitled to get our thoughts out there, maybe we are the people who need to step back and just allow other people the space for their ideas. So I think we do need to do that.
And Tony, can I push back on that a little? Because I love the idea. I think, but both of you and Monica are onto something. And here's where the discomfort I see will happen is when we allow people to share their ideas who have less power and they speak their truth, right?
Yeah.
And that truth is not our truth. And that truth actually may be calling us out, like to some degree, right? Calling out the power structure, maybe not us personally, but the power structure. How is that look in terms of you as a person saying, I'm going to let someone else be empowered to speak? Is that still safe for you? You see, like help me with that piece.
Yeah. So I think, so I guess I want to be aware of my language too, that I'm not letting somebody, I'm just not exerting my, so number one, but number two, I mean, I think that it's going to feel differently for different people. And I think that where I was 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago was a different place than I am now. So personally, I feel like I'm really good at hearing things. Not always, and I certainly have gone through different stages of feeling like super guilty for everything that, feeling guilt and feeling all these things. But I think that I've sort of personally, like I've moved further. But sometimes it's difficult to hear things. And that's what has to happen.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, that's one of the things as governance teams, I want you to be thinking about when you're on the dais, right? Your main public meetings, and with this reopening schools and all the hot topics that we're going to, talk about in a little bit, people are going to push back. And as power structures, you have the ability to not only shut them off by not responding, or like literally you can mute their mic and kick them out, right? I mean, literally, this is that piece where as a governance team, you have to wrestle with, is this safe? Am I unsafe, or am I uncomfortable? Right. So when people are on there and they're hollering and screaming, say, I'm gonna come find your house and all that kind of stuff, that's lack of safety. And we don't shut that down. Right. But when we're talking about, I feel uncomfortable because they're calling us out. And even like people will say, you're a racist, right? Like that's the one bad word, like nobody's ever supposed to be told, right? That's someone's truth. Because then maybe that's just what they've heard, and that's just, they know how to use that word to trigger people. But how do we even respond there? Is this unsafe now because someone called me a racist? Or am I uncomfortable because I don't understand where they're coming from? And then, and I bring this up because as governance team, this is where we're going to learn how to use our questions, right? Our clarifying questions, and learn how to lean in and stay engaged in this work, even when it gets uncomfortable. Because it is easy to say, thank you for your 2 minutes, bye, and we're done. And then this type of work, once we open it up, people are going to want to engage more. You're actually going to get more engagement, right? And we got to embrace that versus push it off because it's going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be people who are going to push back and say, no, I think you're wrong, that kids don't deserve to be in these classes. They're going to fail if you allow kids to go in the class because they're not qualified to be in there. I don't know why you would think that's okay. That's going to be offensive to some of us, right? But again, how do we stay engaged even when it's uncomfortable versus thinking it's not safe? So that's why I'm going to bring this up. So anybody else want to share? What do you need for it to be a safe space? Those were two great things, Tony and Monica, by the way.
So I just want to make a comment that I appreciate all of you to always just to give me the space to explain myself, because sometimes it takes me a little bit longer. I'm still working on this, like translating what I want to say, the stuff that sometimes that comes out of my mouth. It's like, I'm still processing my brain, and it's just hard to explain like right now. So anyway, I appreciate that extra space to be able to explain myself, even though sometimes it's like what I'm saying is not what I'm thinking, but I'm trying to think of a way where it's like, okay, I'm explaining the way I'm feeling. And sometimes those feelings are hard to get out in words, I guess, and then I overcome with emotion, and then it's like, it doesn't sound polished, and it's like, okay, did I just get my point across or not? So, I do appreciate all of you to give me that time to explain how I feel sometimes. So, because I think that's important too.
Good. Thank you, Carla, for that. That's what makes it safe for you, is you can speak your truth, is what I call it. You speak your truth, and we don't have to polish it for people. Now, yes, you're board members, and politically you all are polished, right? But you have to have safe space to be you, and I think that's an important one, Carla. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you, governance teams, for obviously that was an affirmation to you, creating safe space for your colleagues. That's powerful.
And I think that, we have to always remember to, or I do, meet people where they are, accept where they are. I'm a listener, but sometimes I feel pressure to say something. Mm-hmm. So I have to dig in there. Is it okay for me to be quiet? Or are people, in my mind, are people expecting me to say something? Mm. Are my constituents expecting me to say something? Do I have a responsibility to them? There are some people who look to me. So am I speaking for them? But I'm by nature a listener, because I really have to stay quiet to really hear everyone. And in that way, I don't make any mistake of seeming dismissive. And also that's part of my culture, growing up in a very Filipino household, parents from the old country who, you're not allowed to speak up, basically, only, especially to your elders. So growing up here, I always felt bicultural, where they teach you to be a good American and speak up. And then at home, I'm being insolent just by asking a question. So that's hard to, unlearn, but but what I've learned in going through the schools with my kids, and that I meet a lot of families who remind me of my mom. Mm-hmm. I need to engage them, make them feel safe, that yes, you have an accent, but that doesn't mean you can't. Please, you are a part of this community. And that's, my mom never liked to speak up because she had an accent, but she spoke perfect English. 5th grade education, perfect English. And she'd always ask me to speak up for her. So maybe that's something that I'm still doing. I feel like I have that responsibility.
Yeah.
But it's okay for me. I have to remember, it's okay for me to just listen.
Yeah. Wow. Powerful. Thank you, Rosie, for that. I think people needed to hear that, right? Like, you need, again, kind of going back to Carla, you should have this space to be safe for you to be you, right? You're a listener. That's okay. But I think you sharing that story helps people understand, like, oh, it makes more sense. But also, I love that you brought up the cultural differences. And we're going to talk about that in our barriers conversation, about cultural differences and how that creates a barrier for this work. So I just appreciate that, Rosie. So I won't go deep into that because you'll have me on a whole nother lesson. But I just appreciate that. Anyone else want to jump in and share? What do we need for this space to be safe?
The humility to know what you don't know, right? And to come in and being open to have your mind changed. That was, again, that what the Equity Network did for me was to help me see, the issues that I carried. and to be able to see things differently from a new perspective.
Yeah.
And that relates to some of what my other colleagues have said, right? It's also, you know, if you've given me the space to change, then I do need to give others a space to change, and that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah.
You know? And so, you know, I think that's how we can bring more of us along on this journey together.
Absolutely. Yeah, powerful, Andy. Appreciate that. As a governance team member, humility and the ability to be vulnerable, right? Like safety is needed for that. And no one will attack you to say you didn't know that or you didn't have the answer. And but you being okay with speaking your truth and being vulnerable in the community is powerful. I just appreciate you modeling that, because that's big. It's one of the biggest hurdles for governance team members, by the way, is to be able to be okay to be vulnerable, right, in front of our community, because we've been taught, go back to cultural nuances, right? We've been taught you're in power, you can't show any quote unquote weakness, like vulnerability is considered weakness versus looking at it as a value to say we always are open to growing and learning and that there's not one way to do things.
I will say that, like, I feel like I'm never allowed the safety piece in my role as a board member, because I'm always required to say the thing. You know, if I don't say the thing, it may not get said. I will say that I have not talked about the Pledge of Allegiance meeting since it happened. I felt abandoned a little bit by the board at the Pledge of Allegiance meeting. That was a hard meeting for me. And it was like, I felt like the really uncomfortable piece of talking about why we didn't say the pledge was left to me entirely. And then no one followed up after I said something. No one said anything to me after the meeting. So I feel alone a lot of the time in the most challenging parts of the work. And, you know, I've been told, we leave this to you a lot, you know, and, you know, people acknowledge it. And I've been very vocal that it's taken a toll on me. It's really hard. That's all.
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking the truth, Kalima. And Kalima, with your permission, I want to use the Pledge of Allegiance example. And there's a lot of examples for boards, by the way, with this piece, where we have, and Deborah and I talk about this a lot, right? Like you're 5 people, but you're individuals, right? So you each have your own individual experiences, and that when doing this type of work brings a whole level of complexity, because something like the Pledge of Allegiance, which I will say, even for me, like as a facilitator, right? Deborah as well, right? We have our own experiences as African-American people around what the Pledge of Allegiance means, right? What the words mean, what it means to stand during a national anthem. Like there's all these different experiences and emotions, but there's still always this one way to do it. And anytime we push back from that, it creates discomfort for everyone. And this is why I go back to racism has harmed everybody, right? So as a governance team, this won't be the only time that there's this, what I call lack of safety. And what I think I hear Kalima saying is that I'm standing on my beliefs, but I want to make sure everybody is standing on that. And it's not just me bringing this up. And I think this is one of the things you'll have to work on as a board, right? And Kalima and I have talked about this too, is that, you know, individually you have your own journey, but then you as a board, it has to be all 5 of you. And part of this is the work, right? And that as a political space, like, what does that mean to not stand during the pledge? Like, that's a whole statement that then you have to unpack as a team. And without knowing how to respond as a team, it makes sense. Like Kalima would feel like that, right? Like I'm on my own, right? And so it tells you, like, as an example of all of these things that you're going to stand for moving forward, you have to collectively be able to figure out how do we all stand, what do we feel? And I just want to offer something for that. Is sometimes lack of safety will happen if we don't make a decision ahead of time together to say, okay, when we go out in public and we're going to all do this together, like we've wrestled with this in closed session, right? We wrestle with this like if we have one-on-one meetings with each other regularly, so that you can talk about some of the things that are really hard. And the Pledge of Allegiance is like a big like rock. That's a heavy one. I just want to say that's a heavy one. That's that alignment with, you know, how Colin Kaepernick felt, right? And in that movement, that was years worth of pain, right? But there were a lot of people who actually agreed with him, but there was a lot of pressure not to do that because there's some fear, right? And that's what racism is. Racism creates fear and all these emotions. So to affirm Kalima's feelings, like I definitely stand in solidarity with you, Kalima, because I have that wrestling too. Like we, you know, at many board meetings, we're standing doing the pledge, and I'm like, do I want to say these words out loud? What do I feel about this, right? Like in schools, like schools who force kids to do it, schools who don't. I mean, it's very much a mixed feeling, but I think for you all, the lesson out of creating safe space is having time to collectively talk about decisions you make ahead of time, so that those moments when they do happen, that there's a feeling of, okay, we all understand this is uncomfortable, right? For several of us, right? But to not be able to talk about it in more depth, sometimes this is what we're going to talk about as boards is taking time before you make decisions collectively, so you really feel that once we do make a decision, we're all on the same page, but we all also know each of our individual feelings about it. And that's hard. It's hard. I got so many examples of those, but that's a great one. I asked, thank you, Kalima, for sharing. And also thank you as governance teams for hearing her truth, right? And trying to understand kind of where that comes from, which takes time. That's a hard one. It's a heavy one because there's so much behind the Pledge of Allegiance that you'd have to unpack.
Definitely. I did speak at that board meeting, you know, and I do stand with you in solidarity, but I know you feel alone. This is the only, what you shared at that meeting was heartbreaking because you just put it all out there. And as a friend, I should have reached out to you afterwards because you could feel it. I mean, you know, but I did speak up at the meeting and to say, you know, why I wouldn't honor the pledge either. But yeah, I know you feel alone. You're the leader, right? And but you know, when we decided as a board not to do the pledge, we never really actually discussed it. It just was very organic. And then it was brought up, it was agendized. But I Nicole, that's your advice that something especially that could be potentially explosive like this, we should have gotten on board beforehand and talked about it among ourselves.
Right. And so I agree with that. I mean, I think the part for me that was hard was hearing, I originally brought it up that I personally just didn't want to do the pledge. And then everyone said, I don't want to do the pledge either. Right. So it was just me personally saying, I don't want to do the pledge, and somebody else do it. And then everyone else said, I don't want to do it either. So that was the initial discussion. We probably should have come back and had another discussion. But the part of the meeting that was hard was it did seem like it was put on me because every board member said, I never thought about why we didn't do the pledge until a student brought it up. So I was like, I brought it up. No one thought about the rationale when I brought it up. You didn't think about it. So that was the part that it really made it feel like it just was like an agreeing with Kalima. We didn't really think about it. We just agreed and didn't really think about why we weren't doing the pledge until a student brought it up. So again, kind of put it back on, we were just following what I was doing, it was a collective decision, which happened at the time. That's the abandonment part that I felt.
Yeah. And I think what we'll do today, which may be actually shortly, because we're going to talk again about this revisiting our roles and our processes. I think this is a good lesson for our process, right? Whatever it is, especially with this type of work, because there's going to be more than the pledge. That's like a heavy thing, but there's some other heavy things you're going to have to tackle. And I think we'll have some protocol. And again, the part of this conversation is about safe space. What do we need to have safe space? And part of what I think we all are going to continue to need is time on our own to reflect on where we're at in our journey, because each of you are in your different journeys and nobody's wrong. I want you to hear that clearly. Nobody's wrong. You're all on your own journey, and wherever you're at, it's okay. The discomfort comes from even what Kalima's sharing, different spaces on our journey. And no one has Kalima's experience. No one has Nick's experience. No one has Andy's experience. Like each of you have different experiences. And so this is where what I call cultural conflict happens, right? And this is normal. And you talking about it is creating safety in itself, by the way. There's healing with talking about it. Okay, and so as you continue to move forward, though, what we want to do is avoid creating that lack of safety by having more discussions with each other, right? And doing those things like using your agendizing time for your in your study sessions around, okay, we're going to make a decision moving forward in public. So let's talk about how that might land, not only for us, but how that lands for the community. So that's the work. So I'm how do I say it in a nice way? I'm glad that happened, not at Kalima's expense by any means, but I'm glad that that was a great example, because you're gonna have many more like that with this type of work. So I just appreciate you all engaging in this discussion. And again, the reason why I spend so much time on creating safe space, thinking about Glenn Singleton's agreements, because without this foundation, this work will go nowhere. It will stop quickly. And the quick stop is usually because of our own emotions associated with this work, right? And the emotions associated with your community, who may not even be remotely close to where you are, but you got to try to bring them along and help them understand the why to this work. So I appreciate the discussion. And
can I jump in just real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Or Nick, did you get a chance to? I want to make sure before I say anything. Go ahead, Nick.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say whenever. I can go after you. It's fine.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for their comments. I mean, to address Kalima, I mean, what you're saying is true. When we bring up things, and I feel low on some topics, I think we all do on some things, but particularly with the pledge, I think it was organic. I think it did come up, like it was obvious. I think not obvious, maybe not as obvious as it should be, really, that we do agree with what you're saying. To be the person to kind of trailblaze those, I don't use the word trailblaze, but like, you know, to be the first one to really step up and push that is that takes a lot. And I respect that and acknowledge that. So that I want to put that out there. And I think we all play different roles in this board. I think we do respect people's spaces and positions. Positionality is important. We're all here, public officials, right? That's a factor. But I do think that it takes a lot to speak up and own those things. And then that helps, naming those things helps push us forward. I know we've all done that on different levels. We all help each other grow in different ways, but that in particular is very important to point out, because sometimes you have to do more than speak your truth. You have to kind of evoke it from other people. And sometimes you inspire people to do that, which I think is appreciated and should be appreciated, acknowledged. Yeah, that's actually, and I think the one thing I will contribute is that what I've noticed as a teacher is being that person in a room at a faculty meeting or in a department meeting or even just one-on-one with a colleague. One of the ways we can respect each other and the depths of our experiences and the lack of depth with some experiences, and like being humble enough to understand that and bold enough to want to share that, is taking that risk with each other. And I think that respecting people to not be fragile, you know, I've noticed with colleagues to put it out there, let's name it on race, you know, being mixed, you know, Latino and white, you know, I know a lot of my colleagues do not have the experience, the adversity, you know, with the kind of diversity they work around. They might not have grown up around that. They might not have, they might not be in a, you know, a relationship where they're exposed to that on a daily basis. They might not be immersed in that. They might not be versed in different languages. So being able to push each other in a respectful way, in a way that we encourage our students, right? Like friends don't let friends be bullies or get bullied or be a bystander. We want people to be upstanders. We want people to stand up with each other. So encouraging our colleagues, and I think inspiring that in our district, maybe starts with us in our district level discussions too, is saying, you know what, you know, I'm going to tell you something, man, that you need to know, because I don't want to let you, you know, don't play yourself like that. Like you're better than that. Don't say that, or that's not, that we don't use that word anymore, but this is why, you know, and do it in an empowering way and not in a disempowering way. Because as educators, a lot of times we want to school people, but we're in the business of education. So let's empower people with the knowledge we got and create those discussions in a way that pushes things forward in, I think, a positive way. And I want to thank everybody for putting it out there like that today so far. So.
Wonderful. And thank you, Nick. You captured a lot of what I was going to say and listening to everyone else's comment. And I hope you just kind of sit in this space for a minute, because you guys just modeled what you are going to have to do along this whole journey. So this is preparing you. You know, I heard some key words: vulnerability. You know, you have to be intentional about things. You have to use a lot of I statements. This is how I am feeling. This is how it impacts me. Not, putting everybody, brushing with the paintbrush, the stroke with everyone. We don't do that. And so this is just helping you build that foundation. This helps you build relationships. A lot of things are happening right now. You're building better relationships with each other so that when you really start pushing down this road, you will understand the perspective that your colleagues are coming from, so that the board and the superintendent are locking arms going forward and helping and bringing and it's not to go against anyone, but it's to help people see that you are a team and you guys are all doing this together. Will you fail or fall in some areas? Absolutely, but you are committed. And so just watching you model this is the real work. This is it. Once you connect to see where you are, what am I contributing to this? What happened there? Can you guys see me?
Yeah, nothing. I think I just went to speaker view. We switched to, yeah.
I think
Something happened.
The button on that. Sorry.
That's okay. And so just, how am I contributing to whatever that thing is that we're talking about? If you always step back and say, well, okay, what am I doing? Because if everyone does that individually, see how powerful the whole team will become. If everyone will say, okay, I know this is where I need to do a better job in this area, if you're going to do this work. Because again, the work is hard and it's also heart work. It will tug at your heart. But the center though, where you have to stay focused, student-centered. And the student-centeredness will make you do this work. So I just wanted to share that with you as we continue this journey with you.
Powerful. So as we transition, I want to make sure the safe space is continued to be honored. And so we will continue as facilitators to do our very best to create safe space. And is that if at any time there is a concern about it, I always tell people, shoot a text to us or shoot the private chat or call us, offline. Like that's what we're here for as well individually, because we want to support the journey. But also want to remind you that this space will be uncomfortable and we intentionally create discomfort so we can grow. So some of the discomfort will come with just some of the new concepts, right? Some of the new language we'll learn, but we want to do that with you so that you can model for others how to embrace discomfort so that we can grow. So here's what I want to do. I want to refresh the screen and share one more time. I think it's going to work. All right, here we go. So just reminding you about some of the work we're going to do and where the discomfort will come. So speaking of discomfort, right, as you all remember reading the Water of System Change article. And that particular article, the point of sharing that with you was to help you think about on your journey as a governance team, you're going to constantly be unpacking this question of like, what's water, right? Like those things we don't understand. I think Andy said, being okay to say, I don't know what I don't know. Right? And unpacking this system called public education. And so that process is almost like what's water? Well, what's governance with an equity lens, right? We're going to constantly have to keep unpacking what that means because we're asking you to govern in a way that school districts have never governed schools, right? School boards have never governed schools. So what's water? Well, let's unpack these conditions. Okay, there's a lot of things that have been going on in public education that sometimes we have not necessarily knew about. And so there's going to constantly, the deeper you go, the more data you get, the more student voices you hear, you're going to start to learn more and more about like, oh, I didn't know that. But once you know, then we're going to expect that you're going to respond and act on it. Okay. And so this article is always a really good one for you to go back to. And also it's going to be at the very end, we'll remind you that this is going to be the framework in the article that we help you with creating your plan of action to support you implementing your LCAP. Okay. So quick thing about equity. Okay, so we're talking about equity and governance. And before we jump back into what equity is, I want you to think about if you could teach somebody in 30 seconds what equity is, what would you say? Okay, so you remember we used to do our 30-second elevator speech? And I always say, like, sometimes all you got is 30 seconds with your constituents. Sometimes that's all you have in time to respond. You don't have a workshop. You just have 30 seconds. So I want you to grab a piece of paper real quick. I'm going to turn the timer on. And you got 30 seconds Whatever comes to mind, let's just kind of reactivate our thoughts. We keep saying the word equity. We've probably said it 50 times already, right? As a collective group, maybe more. Okay, what the heck is equity, right? So what does it mean? So I want you in 30 seconds. Once I say go, you are going to write down what equity means to you. And again, when you're teaching this to somebody else. So pretend like Deborah and I have no idea what equity means. Okay, and you're going to teach us. Okay, what would you say to us? What would you do in 30 seconds? Okay, so I'm going to put the timer on and you are going to start now. Five seconds, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, pencils down. Now take that piece of paper and I want you to just sit it aside for a minute. Okay. Be okay with non-closure because I can see Tony's like, that was not enough time. I do not like this game, Nicole. Can you please try something different, right? Okay, but y'all have a little bit of non-closure. I promise we're gonna go back to your 30-second lesson on what equity is. Okay, just put it to the side. Be okay with it. Don't add anything to it. Don't cheat. Okay, I promise we're gonna go back to it. But whatever was on your mind that you're gonna teach, keep that in mind. And just have a little context before you go back to your lesson. All right, now, a couple of clues, okay, where we're going and where we've been going. Each time we come to you, we want to make sure we keep building our understanding of what does equity mean. So there's kind of 3 big buckets that I want you to always think about as a governance team because you're operating again at this like 30,000 foot level. So there's some basic things we want to make sure we know. So one is, what does equity mean, which was that 30-second lesson I just asked you. Okay, so in 30 seconds flat, what does it mean? Okay, we got to make sure we have that. We also have to make sure we understand what are the challenges to equity. Okay, so now that we know what it means, what are the challenges to getting to that? And then of course, the third piece is, what do we do about it? Okay, and so we're going to unpack that continuously, but most of we'll be doing that in session 4 with you. Okay, because this is our 3rd of our 4 sessions. So we'll unpack this last one. But what I want you to think about, what does equity mean? Well, we all agree, we've all talked about this before, equity and equality are not the same thing. Check, we know that. Okay, you can explain that to people, right? Equity and equality is not the same thing. Equality is giving people the same thing. Equity is giving our kids what they need. And as Dr. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade reminds us, when they need it. So there's a sense of urgency, okay? Some students need more than others. And the reality is our kids are brilliant and they actually demonstrate success in different ways, not just based on our testing. So when we talk about equity, it's not just about the CAS scores, it's not just about grades, okay? It's about student success and they demonstrate in many different ways. That's what equity is about. Now, the most critical thing is this work is about policy, so governance teams, right? It's about changing policy. It's about changing practice in our district, but it's also about changing our mindset, our mental models about interruption. So our whole purpose of equity in education is to interrupt a system that was never designed to be equitable. Okay, now that wasn't 30 seconds, but that was close, right? Okay, you see equity, what does it mean? Basic understanding. Now we're gonna go deeper into it in a second. But the challenges, I want to also remind us that we're going to have to keep unpacking. We did the history of public education, if you all recall. Okay, and the history reminded us that we were never in a space where it was designed to be equitable. So in the end, we're going to have to start to unpack even more the resistance to this work. And some of the things are going to show up like privilege and entitlement, implicit bias, microaggressions, stereotypes, and that good old thing, racism. Okay, so we're going to unpack some of that today in a little bit. But before we go too deep into that, I want to remind you about just your definition of equity in your district. Okay, now here's a couple of images that kind of remind us. Okay, so the one on the left just remind us again, equity is not equality. There's obviously a reality. So we know that in Jefferson, there is a reality. And so that is not equity nor equality, right? So we have lots of work to do. But ultimately, our goal in the end, when we talk about interrupting inequities in the system, is just that liberation piece. Like eventually we'll get to a place where these are no longer a conversation, that the barriers in education, those conditions in the water that have been existing, that those actually be removed. That's liberation. That's like our dreamland, right? Now, here's the tricky part to answer this question. What does equity mean in JUHSD? Let's go to the image on the right. You remember the whole elephant blind man poem? So you remember in the poem, they had these 6 blind men filling on the elephant, right? Elephants like equity, right? And everybody's filling on it, and they all have a different perspective, a different feeling about what equity is. And all of the blind men are wrong because none of them say it's an elephant. They just say it's a part of the elephant. And they even say like the part of the elephant is something totally different. Like the tail is a rope, right? And the ear is a fan, like just way off. That is not what that is. That is an elephant. But they all are right. Every single one of them are right because they all have their own unique perspective. And so what we have to think about is, so what does equity mean in JUHSD? Does everybody have the same common understanding? And I would venture to say, you all would say probably no, right? But here's the great news. One of the first ways to create common language is for the leadership team, the governance team, to create some starting point. And so that's where your equity statement came in, as you all recall. And so we spent time in October, and we're not going to go deep into it, but you all have really created a space where you have a definition of equity, right? And this was the one, I believe, your third one. We had 3 versions, and I think this was the third one. So take a look at this because we want to talk about where you go next with your equity statement. So take a look at it. And again, this is a draft, so I want to make sure the community knows this is a draft, right? And that you all are going to adopt this with your policy, if I'm not mistaken. I want to make sure I say that right. Okay. So just take a look. Cut off a little bit, huh? Just trying to make it as big as possible so you could see it. Just take a look at your equity statement. So as you're looking at it, notate some of the things that you may want to go back to in a future study session as far as some of the words that need to be updated or changed. Again, this is a draft, so don't feel too much pressure to make any changes today. This is a draft. And as you think about your statement, think about some of the words that stick out to you. Now, as you look at this statement, I want you to be thinking about how we would apply something like this and the purpose. Like Deborah and I asked you to create a statement for a reason, right? So this is what it means to us. And this is a lens by which we see our work as a governance team. So how do we apply this statement to the work we're doing? And that's kind of the big piece. Like, why do we have a statement? So we can have common language, common understanding, a common lens for when we look at policy. Right? We want to examine policy. And so we want to examine it with an equity lens. Well, what is our equity lens? It's here. So how do we apply it as a governance team? Well, your wonderful new superintendent, your staff, they're going to come with you to you. Your community is going to come to you with all kinds of things that you're going to have to consider adopting, taking action on. And when we think about how do you apply your equity statement? Well, think about how you might take this statement and physically have it at the dais with you so you see it all the time, right? Because you want to remember, some boards actually have it pasted right there, just like you have your mission statements, your vision, you got your equity statement. And as you make decisions, when you're looking through the packets that are sent to you, as you're looking at what action items are coming ahead of time, how do I take this lens and ask those questions to the staff? How do I take this lens and look at, do I make this decision and realize that this policy or practice actually fits our equity statement, what it means? And if it doesn't, how do I not necessarily push back, but how do I question that and ensure that we get to that place? Deborah, I'm going to ask you to jump in a little bit more too, because you've obviously also seen boards have to wrestle with how do we apply our statements to our work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was glad that you said, because I had just jotted down, make sure you have this on the dais with you, because this is something that you don't want to just be able to recite, because eventually the community has to see this demonstrated. Can you tell by looking at your agenda that this is your equity statement? You know, your presentations that are given to you by staff, does that support this? So now this would be, how does everything filter through the statement? Because now we're saying, this is who we are. And of course, like we've always said, equity is not just checking the box. We've done that. That's not what it is. You're saying this is who we are. This is our culture. This is what we do. And so now that you've been bold enough to make this statement, now everything needs to funnel through that. It's woven through everything that you do. And that's the hard work. That's where intentionality has to take place. And you're stepping back and taking your time, reviewing, and make sure that this is what we said. Now we have to demonstrate it. And so it's going to take time to get in the habit of doing this in a natural way, easier way, but just intentionality, pause, and just make sure that you are doing exactly what you said you're doing. And it's okay to hold each other accountable. Like Nick has said, kind of pull my coattail if I'm not doing it, if my conversation on the dais is not aligned with this. And so that's what a governance team will do, because at the end of the day, you want to be an effective governance team in order to do this work. Yeah. So that's what I would encourage you to do.
Powerful. Someone want to jump in from the team and just share your thoughts about where you see yourself moving forward with your equity statement and applying it to your work.
So I'm hoping that we can have this sent out to the community for feedback in some form or fashion. I know we're working to put the equity committee back together, but I think it still could be sent out maybe after the holidays just to get feedback in some way. The way I would like to see it utilized is when it is completed and when it is finalized, regardless of what we do with the pledge, I just feel like if it was up to me, I would have it replace the pledge. And we say this at every meeting, because I feel like this is something that I feel committed to pledging my allegiance to right now. And really, my heart is in this. But so that's just how I feel about it. But I still think regardless of what we do with the pledge, it's something that should be said out loud at every meeting.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Powerful.
From my perspective, I mean, that was actually a really cool comment, Kalima. With regards to the essence of the equity statement, some of the words may change, but the themes will remain, and how do I take this lens, continue to ingrain it in the way I view things as I'm sitting in the meeting, as I'm visiting campuses, things like that, visiting programs. How do I internalize that and to be able to see it through this lens? And this is the harder part, because there will be things I miss. I know that there have been things I have missed, but I need to be able to actually just simply continue to internalize the statements that are in here. And how do I approach looking at everything with the intentionality that this statement says that we are promising to do? And that's the challenge. So the idea of having it with us on the dais at such time that we're able to be in physical meetings again, and for me to have this open, as we continue these, virtual meetings, that sort of thing, I need to be able to continue to internalize this and grow with the principles that they're in. I mean, it's taken me 3 years to get to this point, and there's a lot more to do.
Powerful.
Yeah, I would say, we can put it on our agendas. If we post our agendas, that's got to be the statement. And it's to see it up here like this, is that it should be for me, it should be a constant reminder so that it becomes nature. It becomes nature, that and what when you brought this up, and Nicole, you were talking about it, and Deborah talking about this, you know, to say that this is who we are. It reminds me of how I live my life, and that I always have to, when I have inner struggles or conflicts, and I'm trying to control things, I have to, what lifts me out of that is when I let go and I trust God. For me, let go and let God. And when I let go and that I'm not in control and accept I'm not in control, then that other, it helps me lead my life better and takes the stress off. So if I can be constantly reminded, and that this is ingrained in me, then this will immediately drive what we do and what I do.
Thank you for that. Tiffany, jump on in.
I forgot I had my hand up. So I was thinking about your question about how do we apply it? And I think when I look at the equity statement and just like recalling the sessions that we've had to build it, there's so many themes. I think like what Andy was saying, that's embedded in the statement. And I think it's about how do we break down what each of these things mean, right? Like, how am I examining injustice? How am I interrupting it? How are we respecting different viewpoints, educating and empowering all students? Like the Water for Change article, Nicole, that you wrote out, like it's not only the mental, what do they call it? The frameworks, but then also the policies and the practices. So taking the values, breaking down what it means, like how am I examining my biases? What is a process in which we're doing that? And then allowing that to, you know, really trickle down and inform the decisions. But I think until we really define what each of these values mean within the statement, you know, we can't guarantee that it'll happen.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I appreciate.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I want to sort of piggyback on that, and you know, I read it. It's nice to like step away for a few weeks and then read it, really thinking about all the words. I'm actually super proud of this statement. And like Andy said, I mean, you know, I saw like the editor and me was like, oh, maybe that should be a period. And then this is right. Something like that. But honestly, this really, I'm proud of this statement. And I feel like oftentimes what happens when organizations write mission statements or write things like that, they're, you know, they sound really good. And then it sits somewhere and it really oftentimes doesn't it doesn't actually affect what's happening in an organization. And so I think that this really sort of building on what Tiffany just said, the work now is, you know, perhaps perfecting the statement a bit, but I think it really says what we want it to say. So now, how is this going to affect what happens for our students every single day? And I think that putting the equity committee back together, because we've had a little break that got a little bit interrupted with the pandemic, and then you know, we've already talked about, you know, how are we going to use our equity statement to sort of build a rubric, something like a rubric where you're kind of looking at everything that you're doing and you're sort of passing it through these ideals. I think that's when the real change is going to start happening, and so I'm really excited for that.
And I want to add too, like, one of the things I heard at CSBA conferences, one of the reasons why I like CSBA conference is that another school district, for another initiative that they started that was in line with closing achievement gaps, they, on the agenda, each item, it would have, like, if it was about interrupting injustice, just for example, of pulling out our equity statement, it was something on the agenda like, this is an item that interrupts injustice, this is an item that helps dismantle systemic inequities. He would say, if we looked at our board agenda and there was nothing from the mission statement that we currently had in place and nothing on the agenda, had anything to do with the mission statement, they redid the agenda. That there should always be something on the agenda. We should always be discussing or working on something that has a direct tie into the current mission that we're working on. So I think maybe having those tie-ins would also help keep us focused and not get too distracted by all the other stuff that could jam up board agendas, and we don't, which has happened to us a lot, and we don't focus on the work outside of work study.
I agree. Can I just second that and say, I've been talking with a colleague about, important versus urgent. What's important and what's urgent. And we need to make sure that we're staying in the important space. And this is really important. And so I love that. I love that idea. And also I love the idea that other board members said of just, having the equity statement read, every single time there's a board meeting, and in district meetings that we have, that those of us that are in multiple meetings all day long, working on all different things, coming back to this. And I'm going to step back now.
Powerful. Now, great input from everyone. And we weren't going to, purposely spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to, one, commend you on you getting this far in your space, being thoughtful. This was your statement. Truthfully, Deborah and I have nothing to do with this, right? Like, this was yours. And we just are helping you think through, like, how are you going to apply it next? And you have a lot of great ideas of next steps. And I know we're documenting these in our minutes and all that good stuff. But wanted to remind you about why it's important to have the statement, right? This is the lens by which you do your work, but it is not the final. And I want to just reiterate for the community, this is a draft, right? And the reason it's a draft is because, yes, the board sets a vision, sets kind of where we're going, but you do want to have the community weigh in on this, because what equity, go back to this slide here, right, is that equity, that whole blind man elephant process, right, has to now happen, right? You're going to have to ask your community to weigh in, because everyone's perspective may not be the same. So, but we do need to have common language and be okay with the discomfort that equity, how we get to equity, to the elephant, may look different. And so getting the input from the community is a great idea. And we'll talk about the equity committee in a minute, because there's a lot of great ways to leverage them. So one of the things that's so cool about the work that we've done with you is that you all have, each time we've come back, we've gotten to reflect on just remembering our role. So now that we, again, have this, like, what does equity mean to us as a team? Now, who implements this work, right? So that's where the tricky part comes in. Who does the work? Because you're all going to be passionate about it. You're all going to be, what's the word? Not only passionate, but you're going to feel an obligation to do the work. Like, that's very natural as people. But we want to remind you that as a governance team, right, you have different roles. And this is always important when we talk about equity work, to remind you about the role of the superintendent, the role of the board, and that as you do your equity work, you keep going back to this clock. I think it's important because, again, you are going to, like, even someone like Nick, I'm going to use Nick as an example, as an educator in the classroom, right? You are an implementer of this work, right? So now you come to the board meetings, right? And you're going to naturally be in practitioner mode. And so it's always going to be a challenge to say, how do I stay above that blue line and make sure that Tony and her team, they do the work, right? And I give insight. So you bring a lot of valuable insight as an educator, but that balance, right, of being able to say, okay, I'm not going to go in and talk to the teachers because I'm a teacher, right? I'm not going to go in and say, hey, I should leave this. I mean, I'm using Nick as an example, but there's lots of board members, again, who struggle with this because they're educators, right? But then there's the other side of it is I'm not an educator. So then do I feel like I lack, this experience? So I need to lean in even more and get more in the weeds so I can make sure I understand. So you all have to just, like, this is a great visual reminder of the roles. Okay. And again, above that blue line, which is dotted for a reason, right? You all get to talk and interact. Absolutely. But who does the work is going to absolutely be the superintendent and her staff. She implements the work. She evaluates the work. She reports back to you on the work. But ultimately, you as the board, you have the vision, you adopt the policies, you ask the questions, you evaluate what's happening. You're the holders of the work, but you absolutely don't have to do the work. What your implementation, your practices look like is the governance practices, right, in itself. But how that work looks in the ground level, this is where we always have to be reminded. So I know, Deborah, we always feel that
this is my favorite slide. This is my favorite. And this is why you will hear us use the language either 30,000 foot view, the balcony, the 10,000. There's a reason why you're up that high, because the board's role is to ensure that the district runs properly. You can't ensure that when you're on the level, the same playing field. That's where your superintendent is. You hire the education expert and you let her do her job. But the only way you can ensure, just think again, that you're in an airplane and you can see how everything is so neatly aligned. But if once you land, you don't have that view anymore. So that's why this is such a good reminder for board members to just stay at that where your authority is, because it's circular. So everyone's role is important, but you can't abandon your role to go and assist the superintendent. So this is my favorite slide, just as a reminder for boards and the superintendent team.
Yeah, powerful. And this slide again is in the PowerPoint. So as you do your study sessions, you go back together as you're doing your performance evaluation processes. You know, these are always just good reminders to go back to. And it's a good assessment, like where are we in this process, right?
Right.
One way I think to think about this is this particular slide here. I'm on the wrong, it went out of order. But this particular slide, so y'all remember this one too? When we went through this in our first or second study session, I can't remember which order, but we went through all the 8 characteristics of effective boards. Remember that? And the whole point of this was really to give you an opportunity to talk about, like, where are we? Like, what are those practices looking like for us as a board, right? And obviously the outcomes are creating the policy, creating the practice, creating the policy, creating the statement, and creating the equity plan. But the 8 characteristics are a good one to go back to remind you about where are we in our process, right? And how are we data driven, right? Do we align our resources based on our equity focus, right? Do we have common vision, common language? Do we have shared belief systems? All these things are really important to go back to. And so this is a good self-assessment. I like to tell folks like quarterly, maybe once a year. I mean, it depends on how you all, do your study sessions. I think every board is different. But you all do lots of study sessions. So sometimes it's nice even just to pick one, right? Just say, hey, let's just pick one characteristic. Where are we at in this process? Okay, so always remember the tools you have to just revisit where are we in our journey, okay? So the most important piece of this work, and then we're gonna take a small break after we cover this last piece here, is thinking about prioritizing our work. So you all spent some time in our last session looking at where do you wanna just kind of prioritize the work. And I think I skipped a slide. Yeah, my fault.
Yeah,
there
go back one. Yeah,
yep.
There you go.
And so prioritizing the work in terms of your equity-driven governance. Okay, so what does this look like? You have practices which were laid out, and this slide is just all messy. Practices were laid out in terms of in the assessment. Okay, so you monitor, this is your role. You monitor the policies. You support the budget, you work collectively as a team. These are all just basic things, right? What does a governance team do? But the policy piece, you all actually prioritized your policy, right? And you said, hey, we're gonna focus on 4 things. We're gonna focus on HR, teaching and learning, the budget, and also the climate, community climate. And so it's important to think about what do we wanna focus on in our practices? What do we wanna focus on in our policies? And what do we wanna focus on in terms of our time around some of these hot topics, we call them. Right? So boards, obviously, yes, you have some things that are prioritized, but the hot topics, right? Ethnic studies, I believe, came up. Obviously, reopening schools is huge, right? All these different things make a difference in the work that you do. And so you have to discuss, like, where are we in our processes so that we recognize hot topics? Yes, we have to deal with those because we don't want our school district to blow up and we not have, great decisions being made on the spot. But also you have to recognize that some of your priorities are going to be those 4 buckets that we talked about in the middle. We're going to unpack that in a minute. So I want to pause for a second because your hot topics, I want to just ask, when you think about your hot topics, do they fall into your priorities, right? Like reopening schools, like think about like, where does that fall? Because that's a big deal. Like nobody ever expected a pandemic. Nobody ever expected, that we would be in a place here where we're addressing institutional racism in such an intentional way. But tell me a little bit about your hot topics and where you feel those fit in your priorities. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second, just so I can, I can't read that slide. I think sometimes Google Docs just squishes things, but go ahead, jump in. Where are you at with your hot topics and how they align with your work?
I think something that we always talk about is special education. For sure. You know, even adult education, right? Because it's, you know, a lot of those students always fall to the wayside and they're not like in the mainstream of our, you know, of our district. So it's like, how are we doing our best to service them and meet them where they're at?
Right.
So anyway, that was the first thing that kind of jumped to mind when you had said that.
Got it. Got it. Okay, anyone else want to jump in? Your hot topics that kind of fall into the priority, your policy priorities. Tell us a little more, because you guys got a lot going on, which most boards do. Tell me a little more.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think for those 4 hot topics, obviously reopening schools and everything with COVID has been such an overarching just level of reframing and forcing us to reimagine, right? Not just school districts, but cities, counties, our federal government, right? And so looking at where I think capacity is always a question, but I'd like to bring it back to things, and Nicole, you said this is, you know, how are we prioritizing these things? Because hot button issues are issues and they're relevant and they're immediate. And so how do we move with things in stride? And
right.
Those are the kind of things, yeah, like police and schools needs to immediately be addressed. And it's not a hard fix, really, it's a conversation and policy making, which is our job. And then, you know, ethnic studies, you know, there's a lot to do with developing what that is and doing it right, doing it justice. But I think, you know, I think my approach to these things with the 4 buckets we're looking at and with our hot button issues, those things we have to figure out how we can do it with some kind of synergy and do it in stride and reframe, like we're saying, our agendas around. President Salahudi mentioned this. How do we structure an agenda that's relevant, in essence, right? If we're having a meeting that's relatively dry in terms of the topics, people aren't necessarily coming out to speak on public comment, that's fine. There are going to be meetings that are more or less exciting, you could say. But I mean, at that rate, we still have to think about every meeting we're having every 2 weeks, you know, at least. The public is expecting some kind of progress on a number of issues. And so we have a governance calendar. We should also have our own policy, you know, and our own, like maybe equity calendar. I mean, I don't think I'm gonna call it equity calendar. It's a calendar that instills equity, right? That we understand that, you know, where are we on this issue? Okay, so every 2 months, we should have at least an update, or, you know, within the scope of a year, we'll have made this progress. So like in special education, we talk about IEP goals, and SMART goals include metrics, right? Like we want to get to this percentage of success by this point, or this is our goal. So if we don't have those meetings, we can't get there. And I think that's how I think reframing what is a hot topic in terms of relevant topics would be maybe an approach for us to consider.
Powerful. Thank you for that reminder. Yeah.
And you know, and some of the staff have in previous meetings have said, you know, we can't let a good crisis go to waste. And so how can we take this opportunity to do things differently and to look at these hot topics differently, right? Especially when it comes to issues of equity and specifically related to, you know, whether it's ethnic studies or institutional racism and grading, you know, these are the sorts of things that we really need. You know, we have an opportunity right now, since it's easy for us easier, I should say, to jump from meeting to meeting as opposed to driving from meeting to meeting. But this is, you know, again, I think there are ways that we can utilize this slowdown, such as it is, to rethink what we've been doing. And I think these hot topics, as delineated, I think are definitely the areas that we can take some time to do, since, you know, we are already in a crisis mode as it is for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, good point. Good point. All right. Other thoughts? Okay, I'll put it back on the screen, by the way. You're like, thoughts, and where's my visual about the thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, so for me, you know, all of these, are things that are important to me, especially ethnic studies, special education, the SRO, institutional racism, are all things that are really important to me, and things that I joined the school board to work on and haven't been able to really deep dive into yet. You know, and it's been year 9.
Yep.
And now we're in COVID.
Right.
So that's the constant struggle for me, is how do we move forward, and how do we move forward on these things in a way that it is really moving forward in it, right? That we're really doing something about institutional racism, or we're having a real ethnic studies program and curriculum that's sustainable and put in, and that takes time, effort, um, you know, people being able to really focus on doing that in similar ways to like our workforce housing. Right, that took a huge effort by board members, by district admin to get the workforce housing in. And so I think that same amount of effort is going to be required to be, ethnic studies, the SRO. So I really think that part of this is going about that work with the same sense of urgency, but also making sure that we have the space and time to do it properly. So what do we need to clear out of the way? We stopped doing other stuff so we could get the workforce housing. So I think we have to look at the current initiatives and other things that we have going and saying, do we need all this other stuff that we have? What is a priority, and what can we focus on, and how can we give it just the space to do it properly so we're not constantly overloading? Because I can already see people rolling their eyes like, here they go, here they go. Here
we go. Yeah, good point, Kaleem. And part of why we bring this up is, when you think about as an equity-driven governance team, one is just focusing on equity is the first piece, right? Which is why you have the statement. So I think that's a big hurdle to now look at how do we prioritize our work, because we can't do everything. You don't have enough time. Your staff can only do so much. And oh, by the way, you're in crisis mode, right? Which I think crisis mode, depending on how you look at it, like Nick said, there's a pandemic based on COVID, but there's also a pandemic based on racism. And it depends on how we look at it, right? I think it depends on how we look at it. So prioritizing your work is going to be important. And I just want to remind you, and again, commend you that you have already begun to do that, right? So again, Deborah and I talk about how you're much further along in this process than many equity-driven boards are. And so I want to remind you about what you did in your last study session. So I just took almost verbatim some of the things you had. You had a document that you had the 4 quadrants, if you recall, and you broke down, you started to discuss like, where do we want to go with these? And we wrestle with, do we have facilities, right? Or do we want to do teaching, learning. So I think that you've landed on some very key priorities for running a school district. I mean, obviously, and there are a lot of ways that other things that come up can fit into these boxes or these kind of buckets of work. The challenge you're going to have is that, once you've identified these, now we have to even go into, now, what does this mean? Right? What does this actually mean? What are we going to focus on? So one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to think about in your next steps are your study sessions. And if you can envision, you're going to need 4 study sessions and probably more, but you're going to need 4 study sessions for each of these, right? Just to even now break down, what does this look like? I vividly remember Nick asking this question. So are we going through each of these, right? And we're going to break down all of the nuances. And so it's like, yes, but that is a separate study session almost for each of these topics, right? And I think that's going to be your kind of heavy lift for the rest of this year is how are we going to break down what we're going to do in our area of human resources. So for example, what I pulled the bullet points on the outside are where you all started to discuss what all of those things look like. And so the big things that come up for HR is obviously there's a process, right? There's the recruitment side of it, bringing people in, and you may want to take your equity lens and say, hey, we're going to recruit. We want to recruit diverse representation of our staff, right? We want to recruit culturally proficient educators. The hiring process is a whole nother piece of the work, right? Like your interview questions, how you actually, screen applicants, right? There's all these things that go into hiring, the process in itself. which has barriers to it, by the way. That's where we go back to implicit bias, right? The decisions we make as an interview panel. So making sure you have diverse representation on interview panels. Bias goes into how we hire people. So it's important that you take your equity lens and say, we got to think about our hiring practices. And then the retention piece is huge, right? And the retention piece is how do we not only keep people who are culturally relevant, culturally proficient, but also people of color, people who represent our students based on some of the demographics that may be underrepresented, but also how do we retain like quality professionals? And so that's where the conversation about coaching comes in, and professional development, and all of those different practices that are high leverage things we can do to make sure we build capacity of our human capital. Because here's the big deal about this one, this part of the pie, is that, 85, 90% of your budget is going in here, right? So when we talk about how important this part is, it's important that the board recognize what are we doing to ensure we have built capacity of the folks that we're spending the majority of our money on, right? So this is a big deal, and why I think it's such a great priority. Your budget, which is right next to it, obviously falls into that too. And so if you can, okay, go ahead, Monica, jump in. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm going to leave in like 2 minutes, but I just wanted to ask before you go on is, as the board is working on this, would it be appropriate, helpful to have more staff involved, more students involved? So that was just something I wanted to throw out there. I mean, you all talk about it, whatever. I have to go, but I just really wanted to ask that question, throw that out there. I love you all. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation, and I'll see you soon.
No, Monica, before you jump off, absolutely. I didn't go deep into it, but when I mentioned those study sessions, that is where like you have to have staff involved, right? Like those are the folks who are going to be doing the work. And also when you mentioned students, like there's the whole process of getting student voice and asking them questions that inform your human resources process, right? We're going to talk a little bit, and you may be off by then, Monica, but we're going to talk in a moment about leveraging the equity committee to help them weigh on all 4 of these priorities so they can have recommendations about it too. So absolutely, this is a process that requires everyone to weigh in on these priorities.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay. I'll see you all later.
Sure. Bye. Good seeing you. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
And a good vacation next week. Happy Thanksgiving.
You too. Bye.
So Monica had
just jump in here real quick. Yeah, and this is where too, I want to remind the board, this is where you pose your what questions to your superintendent.
Yeah.
Because remember, the board this is what we need, and the superintendent this is how we're going to do it. You have the conversations, but just remember to allow the implementation to reside with the superintendent and her staff.
Yeah, and in our next slide, we're going to go through a couple of questions that were similar to, you remember in our last study session, I had questions that you can ask the staff, that you can ask the superintendent, but just kind of backing up, just what are you going to ask about, right? So it's got kind of this process of you have an equity lens through your statement. We're going to obviously unpack your policy in a little bit, but what are those 4 big buckets that we're going to focus on that the staff knows that you're going to focus on, by the way, right? So that's where the questioning comes in. So the HR piece, again, just to give the board context, right? When you're looking at HR, what are those things you want to focus on, right? And so recruitment, hiring, retention, those are big, and those are questions you can definitely ask. And again, study session is needed for this. Okay, so we're just literally doing like an overview.
But just to
the budget.
Back on Monica's point really quick, I do think that we need to, and I talked to Tony about this, like I do think that we need to have a process on how we roll out initiatives. And that I don't think that we have a clear process right now, because what I don't like, and again, I'm fine as a board member approving something that our teachers and staff are not thrilled about. We've done it in the past. But I would rather not. I would rather have some sort of buy-in to what we're doing and not having us approving initiatives where, almost all of our teachers are saying, don't do that. And so we have a similar thing with grading. It is getting better. Like there is more teachers speaking out on behalf of grading and changes to grading. but it's like a 50-50 split. And, you know, I don't want to create a war zone. We had the same thing when we did our math. You know, when we changed our math, like all of our teachers came out and spoke out against it.
Yeah.
So I just don't like being put in a decision where I feel like I'm choosing between the kids.
Yep.
If I have to do that, I can. But is there a way or a process that we can roll these things out where I feel like it has been vetted? So, for an example, when Jefferson High School decided to move to, you know, their I can't remember the name of the initiative now, but where they have like a homeroom type of environment where they can go and check in with their teachers. Flex time. When they did flex time, they had to get, I forget, a certain percentage of their teaching staff had to vote in favor of it
Right.
before they move forward. So the school was given that
Right.
directive, but as a district, we have nothing in place.
Right. So Kalima, let me jump in and say what I think you're hitting on is a couple of things, right? Because remember we talked about a communication process is what I hear you saying too. But I also want to remind you that remember your role as a board is not necessarily to go that deep, right? So that's what I think you're struggling with is I love what you said about how are we going to roll this out, which is a legit question. And I think it goes back to your study sessions time, right? Like this is where you collaborate with your superintendent, your staff to talk about how are we going to roll this out? Because every situation may be a little different. And how deep you go into that, I think the process that you're asking as a board is, I want to know, right? So communicate to me so I can speak to it, but also I want to understand the process. And I think that speaks to communication. So I think, Tony, what I'm hearing is like, how are we going to roll out, like, you know, what is our communication in terms of once we get behind a priority, then how do we report back to the board, right? So I think that's what I'm hearing. And then also, Kalima, what I hear you saying is like, tell us your process that lands at the school site. So, you know, it's being proactive, right? If something comes up, at least we can speak to it, but our role is not to really get into the weeds of every detail of how it rolls out. And I think that's the tricky piece about this work. So the big answer to that, Kalima, is in your study sessions for budget. You should be talking about how are we going to roll this out. In your study session for human resources, how are we rolling this out? I think that's what you want to do for each of these. And you will find that that process becomes part of the culture of your board, right? Because there's more to it. Like Tony's going to send you some things, you know, in a board packet. And one part of the process is we got to read it, right? Like simple things, right? To even know so that Tony's not spending her entire time or you have 1,000 minutes of board meetings when some of these things you all are gonna have to study on your own prior so you can better understand. So it's even not like our time management is gonna come into. Tony, jump in, you had a thought. Oh, you're on mute still.
I do that all the time. Oh my goodness. Yes, to what Nicole just said. And I also think I hear you, Kalima, saying that there have been, Grizzly Flex Time is a good example. Like there was communication, as Nicole's talking about, communication, and then listening to the teachers and sort of, you know, not forging ahead with something when there was complete opposition to it. So I think that the communication on the front end is really, really important. And then as you're going, the communication. So it really is communication and, you know, buy-in, right? Like sometimes we think we have a great idea and everybody's not there. So, you know, education and communication, I think, is really important.
Right. And I think that to me, like, that keeps me out of the weeds. And I don't want to be in the weeds. I think the thing that forces me into the weeds is when we have a really contentious board meeting and I have nothing to fall back on to say, you guys should be fine. They did this, they did that. They had meetings. You had this time to give input. You had that time to give input. Now we're at the board meeting, like all that stuff has happened. I usually don't have that to fall back on when I'm hearing two different versions. I'm hearing usually at the board meeting the first time, we did this, we did that. And, you know, so if I could have that front loaded so I know what the rollout process was, and that there actually was, like Nicole is saying, like there actually was a thing. And so, yeah, we can bring those up in work studies and I could ask for those in advance. But I think there should also, for big initiatives, just be an expectation of this is something that should be presented to the board.
I can jump in too. I think that sounds pretty on point to me. Just channeling my experience as a teacher, buy-in is usually, it falls squarely on the desk of a principal. Not that it should necessarily. We have more than one district admin, more than one site administrator, and we have department leads, and we have, teacher leads, coaches. There are so many people who play, I think, an influential role on school sites that when we're setting agendas for our district and think about reframing things and understand our priorities and hot topics, rolling out initiatives is a very important area of that, with, I think, the input from our district community. Getting that and mirroring that maybe is having those discussions with site admin and empowering them to feel like this needs to be on your agenda. So we have a district initiative, we're moving forward with equity, and these are the ways that we're considering it. If people didn't tune into the meeting, that's fine, because I'm not going to ask every teacher in the district to tune into a 3-hour meeting, once a week. Obviously, some key highlights, right? So being inclusive of them in that process, and I think Monica spoke to this too, is getting that feedback from the community and from our union, from our district altogether, all stakeholders. That would empower them to feel like their faculty meetings mean something, that they have a meaningful say in bringing their student voices forward, the parent voices forward in the community by using those faculty meetings in a way that's constructive. Because as a teacher, I can say this too about my fellow colleagues, nothing is more frustrating than having a meeting about nothing, where you're there during collaboration time and you're collaborating on just learning information, but not having some agency in it. And so maybe creating some space for that. I know that there are different, ways to navigate agenda planning at the site level, but creating some inclusion in that would help empower our meetings as well. So we have some synergy there. We're not working, talking past each other.
Yeah, Nick, I just appreciate you saying that, because I feel like that about board meetings, and I'm sure you all can concur. It's no offense to you as board members, but sometimes I'll go to board meetings, I'm like, oh my God. And I can imagine what community members are thinking, like, what are they talking about? This is just not relevant, right? It goes back to relevance. And I know as board members, you have to have certain things on your agenda that the community will never understand, right? It's just governance. But I love what you said about that, is having purpose to this. And that's where equity, like when you're creating your agendas, right? Like, how does equity drive the agenda so that you don't have so many, what I call just operational things, like what I would say as staff meetings, right? Like as a principal, is like, oh, these are things I could share in an email with teachers, right? Like I don't need to hold like the whole agenda for this. So it's like, how do you determine, again, prioritizing your agenda items? And I love that these 4 buckets can help generate that to some degree. Obviously your hot topics are going to play a role, but then even when public comment comes in, because public comment is a version of input. I know we don't always see it that way, but public comment is people's perspectives speaking their truth. And so if your agenda is focused on equity, then your input is going to get, because remember, they only can speak on the agenda item, right? Except for your one, here's a chance to talk about whatever you want. But the reality is that you control that narrative in terms of even what you want to hear as a board. And then those key questions you have for the staff, which I'll show in the next slide, can help you kind of stay focused on how do we create a culture of doing equity work together as a governance team? What works for the governance team as far as communication? How does it help to have the staff? What does it look like for teachers? So there's a culture that they know, here's how we give input, right? Obviously, Tony, you all have your process for negotiations, but just even communication with the union reps, like how often that looks and what their process, like all of this really is centered around what you said as a tone as a governance team. And again, the focus areas, once you keep, I call it training people, but how you create and foster a focused environment on equity, it comes from the board. So that, again, go back to that facilities conversation or that one little minute item that one person is stuck on, right? And that ends up taking up all your time. That's not equity focused governance. That's being knee-jerk reacting to a moment in time, right? And that's where we go back to hot topics. How do those hot topics, how can you see those things infused into these 4 areas? Okay, and so again, I employ you to think about in your governance calendar that you look at 4 study sessions coming up that are each going to be dedicated to these, so that you can flesh out how you're going to communicate, how you're going to get input, and then also what those questions are going to look like moving forward. And then we'll talk about the equity committee in one sec, because I want you all to be able to take a break too. But here are some of the questions to think about. Okay, and this is for as board members to be fair to the staff, to Tony and her staff, what they can expect as they're implementing the work. And that's why I go back to that clock that Deborah loves, right, to use, right, is remember above the blue line, below the blue line, the role of the staff is to implement, but you also don't want to catch them off guard where they're not prepared to answer your questions, right? We don't want it to be a gotcha game. We want it to be that they know this is the culture, this is what the board's priorities are. So here's what I'm going to be prepared to do ongoingly. So some of the key things, you know, I highlighted in red some of the things that should come out for you in terms of your focus and really looking at evaluating the progress of your work. And so one is, you know, how do our priorities actually align with our LCAP? And I think that's going to come up because your budget is aligned with your LCAP. So that's a great kind of budget question because your budget is laid out in the LCAP. So I think that's going to be important for you to think about. How does this align with our LCAP? How does the practice align with our equity statement and our policy? So I think that's going to be something because you're going to have lots of presentations about here's what we're doing, right? You're going to get this. Here's what we're doing. And so a great question is how does it align with equity, our equity statement and policy? And eventually you won't even have to ask the question anymore. Eventually we'll know. Like when I was a principal and I had to report to the board or report, you know, we do like our annual, like, what do you call them? Your school, oh my God. Your SIPSAs, right? Remember they do their SIPSA report, right? Like every year they do a data presentation to the board and here's how we're doing at this school. And so we knew like the board's priority is to hear this. So we're gonna always make sure we speak to that and that becomes a culture, right? In terms of people knowing we are focused on equity. Here's our statement, here's our policy. You already know the questions that are coming. So you have those already ahead of time, but you're gonna, as a board, you're gonna have to ask these initially. Another great question, what data do we have or do we need to identify equity gaps that exist? Because part of what you're going to be doing now is with HR, with the budget, with teaching and learning, with school climate, you have data, but there's still some equity gaps that you all don't know what you're really going to need to focus on, right? You might think you know, but always the question is, how do you know? And that's a great question to ask. So we can't just get worked up around, we know kids are getting suspended based on this, and we should have the SRO lead because and all this emotion behind it. But it's like, well, what does the data say? We could be misguided because we don't have the right data in front of us. So it's always good to start with the data. And that's a great question. What data do we have to basically show evidence of what you're referring to in terms of this equity gap? And what data do we need, which helps inform the staff on what other things do we need to collect? I think that's really, really important. I'm going to pause because I see a lot of chat. So let me pause. Okay. Hi, Candace. Happy Thanksgiving. So since Candace is leaving, someone's taking more notes, yes? I want to make sure. I know Candace had some, I want to make sure. Let me pause.
Hi, Candace. Yeah.
You're good on your note taking still, you all?
Bye, everyone.
Hi, Candace.
I think
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. I'm sorry to interrupt. I did not.
Okay.
Hi, Candace. Have a good Thanksgiving.
My mom's waiting, so sorry.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nicole, I have not been taking notes. I'm not sure. Actually, I should have asked Candace if she has a document she's been using. I will take notes. And I'm thinking too, you had a note-taking sheet.
Yep. And I have several things I've been taking, and this is recorded, so we can always go back and make sure if you need to.
It might be better for me to do that so that I can participate.
Yeah, no worries. No worries.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good. And I forgot to remind y'all earlier about what you want to capture, but I have some stuff I've been writing too. So no stress. Good. We're good.
Very good.
All right, so the last two questions just to think about is how can we measure the impact of this practice or policy? So that's an important thing to think about is while you're doing all of the work you're doing, you do have to figure out, is this even impactful or are we wasting our time? I think that's a very legit question. And so you have, it kind of goes back to the data piece again, is how do we know this is working, right? So great one, one of your hot topics, ethnic studies, right? So once ethnic studies is officially implemented and rolled out, how are you going to actually know it's working? And that's going to be really important for a governance team because remember, some of these things don't really systemically really change things for like 10 years, right? So you have to have, I call them pulse checks. This is the pulse check question, right? In between, like, how do we know this is working? It might be, we feel like we're taking 3 steps backwards, by the way. right? But you have to, when you do equity work, you will expect that it's not going to always work well in the beginning because there's a lot of messiness, there's a lot of mindset shifts, there's a lot of discussions that have to happen, adjustments. So this is your question. You always want to, how are we measuring the impact? Is it working? Where do we need to adjust? But we're not going to abandon this because it didn't work in 1 year. I want to say that again. We're not going to abandon this because we didn't think it worked in 1 year. That is not systems change. That is knee-jerk responses. And it means you didn't have the clear vision in the first place, right? Anything you're going to put in with equity work is a long-term process. So that's a great question to ask and not be discouraged if it's not working. I do want to add one caveat to your communication conversation. One of the things that helps board members and the community to feel better about the work is that we communicate even the small wins, right? So how are we measuring the impact? Small wins, like little things like, oh my God, at this school site, I noticed after the staff meeting, the principal facilitated that, there were a lot of discussions in between and there were a lot of emails to the principal and to each other, just saying that, oh my God, that resonated with them and here's what they're gonna try. That is a celebration. You might not see like the data for the kids change all of a sudden, you got this equity gap closed, but what you see is a gap closure in mindsets, right? And narratives and belief systems. And that's what you want to celebrate so that people feel like this work is happening. So that's important too. And then last but not least, what are the barriers that are existing for student success? And this was going to be something that's going to be the discomfort when you start asking kids questions, you're going to ask staff questions. There are going to be things that pop up where you're going to find out that there are some barriers we're still going to have to address. Okay, and those things you don't always know because you haven't implemented the work yet. But once you start the work, you're going to find that barriers will erect themselves because you're interrupting, right? So even something like ethnic studies, you put that in, you're going to find there's some barriers, and it could be barriers based on, you know what, in this particular classroom, we have 4 kids who their families are just not liking this at all. They're pushing back, the teacher's feeling uncomfortable because they're unearthing some things that are making it uncomfortable for the kids. And you never know. So what are those barriers? Because that teacher might need additional support, right? The parents might need additional communication about why are we doing this? So these are all the things you have to always ask. What are the barriers? And it's okay. You should expect there are going to be some negative things that come up, but it's just how we look at those so you can respond in a proactive and like effective way. Okay, so questions about questions, like questions with purpose, right? Like we want to make sure we're really getting ahead of things. And so any questions about these before we talk about the equity committee? And we'll take a little break so you all can stretch and go to the restroom before we go to our last 2 pieces. No questions?
Actually, it's not so much a question, Nicole, as it is just more of a statement. This actually kind of goes along with us having the equity statement alongside, because these aren't the sorts of questions that we need to be carrying with us on every agenda topic, quite frankly.
Right.
And I think this and this is pretty critical to remember, and so thank you for this.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that affirmation. I agree. It's helpful.
I also want, I just want to jump in. I just want to make a comment really, that I just want to say this because I'm just letting it roll off my tongue. Superintendent Presta has already been in our district for a while. So, and the great thing about having her here is that she already knows what has been going on, and she again has like lived her job to the, like kind of like the equity philosophy that we are trying to align ourselves with, especially in the human resource department. So I just feel like really excited that she's here to continue this work, because she's already actually started even before she got to this point. So it's just, anyway, it's just great. I just wanted to make a comment about that.
Yeah. It's big. That's huge, Carla.
I know. Like I was like, oh, we can actually like say that this 1/4 piece of the pie has already been worked on. Like so.
Difference. That makes a difference. Yeah.
Right. So then and then for her to actually have input and guide the rest of the 3 pies is it's really great. So
absolutely,
I wanted to say that.
Yeah. What a great point. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Carla. I just realized I thought I was muted, but I'm not. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Powerful. So last but not least, before you take a break, one of the things that I know that you all were thinking about, you know, like how when we roll things out, like how do we implement this work? And one of the things that's really important, going back to the water of system change article, is there's a piece in there that talks about power dynamics and relationships, right? It's the people part of the work. And this speaks to, I think Nick spoke about it, you know, Kalima, when you mentioned about like, what is our process for rolling things out, and this communication. But one of the things that's important is having a body of people who represent diverse, what I call representation of your community, of your district, to be a group you can lock arms with to weigh in on a lot of this work, right? You want other people's input besides just yours, because go back to what's water, right? Like that whole analogy, the fish analogy, is as a board, you are kind of at this level, or you're in this part of the water, and there are some things that people have what I call a pulse check on that we just don't have. Right, we don't know. And so it's important to have a body of people who are going to partner with you to do this work and to weigh in, but also know that no one is the expert at this work, right? And that even like Deborah and I call us facilitators. We're not experts at this work because we are also on the journey as well, right? We are in a body of water where equity has really never taken place in education because it wasn't designed to. So everyone's always learning, everyone's on a personal journey. So it's really important that you have when I say diverse representation, I think of perspectives first before I think about ethnicity and gender and all those things that are important, right? But I think about perspectives because you want to make sure that you have folks who are going to weigh in, and people who may not all believe in this work, by the way. You can't have everybody who's just you're preaching to the choir either. Right, you want to have people who are kind of on the fence a little bit. You want to have people who are going to push back and be kind of what I call an agitator, right? Yeah. So agitators are good people to have as long as you have a relationship with them and you can meet them where they are. That they're not so much of agitator that they just distract and disrupt the work, but that they are ones who are going to make us think very clearly about who we are and where we're going. So saying all that to say, leveraging your equity committee, who you already have created, right? Like I got to meet them, amazing people. We didn't get to go far in the work, but we definitely got to unpack some things around just creating for them. It was like awareness about, again, what's water. So we did the history of public education. We had a chance to discuss like, what does equity mean? But now, like, how do we go back to that team and start to utilize their passion for this work, right? Some expertise to some degree, their perspective, knowing that you're going to have a heavy lift and the staff cannot be the only ones to do this work. The board can't be the only one. So here's a couple things that I would recommend. And I really look forward to collaborating with Tiffany, because I know with Tiffany playing a real huge role in supporting your equity work internally, it's important that when you think about how do you lock arms with everyone, all your partners, right, and every kind of stakeholder in the system, you're going to need someone to hold the work that I call having outsiders, right? I call it outsiders for a reason, because often when we get to facilitate, because we don't have like the dog in the fight, right? Like we're able to say things, we're able to create a perspective that sometimes when you're in the work, like Tony said, I want to just participate, right? You want you all to have an equity committee that can participate and not really have any bias one way or the other, right? Facilitators like myself and Tiffany, although we adore you, right? We're still the outsiders. And so, yes, we are going to have a different perspective. So saying all that to say, when you have your equity committee, we always think you should have an outside facilitator, but you also have leadership within who works with the district to create the agendas, to create the focus, to weigh in on where are we going. When things aren't going well, we might have a moment in time, some hiccup happens. How do we come back together and make sure that team is a part of it? So what you see on the screen is three kind of things to think about. I know I also share with Tiffany a framework that I've used, and you all can adjust it however you like, but there's kind of three big things to think about how to use your committee. So one is their whole purpose. What is the purpose of an equity committee? It's really, you want to create a space for collaboration. So you want diverse perspectives about your equity priorities to happen in one space, and it's collaborative, right? People get to share. You want this group to be your researchers and these folks who analyze data. So when I say researchers, not like they're the PhD, you may want to have a couple of folks have a PhD, but that's not the determinant. Research that I talk about is how do you take this group who can unpack and examine some of the policies and practices, and also take some of the data that you have as a district and analyze that so that they can come up with what are some key recommendations the board can consider. And I say board, but also district leadership. So that's kind of the big picture. Is this group is really an advisory, right? They kind of are an advisory committee, and I know you've had those before. The outcomes, one of the big outcomes for this group, which kind of goes hand in hand with your equity action plan that we want the board to consider, is they actually come out with an equity plan. So if you can envision, that plan has your 4 priorities, right? And maybe budget looks a little different for them. But when I say priorities, usually 3 to 4 priorities that they can go into what we call subcommittees, and they can really unpack them. So let's just give an example of your school climate one, your community climate. You probably will have a subcommittee that can just do like the safety and the discipline piece, the SRO piece. They can focus on that. And in the action plan they create for you and their input, you have a focus area and some action recommendations around safety, around SRO work. You may have the same thing that you want to do around teaching and learning. So you have an academic subcommittee, right? So they can also unpack it. You kind of give them a data point and they can unpack that and really come up with recommendations. And so it's a really powerful place to be, because in the end, if you can imagine, if you go back, if you bring your committee back together in, let's just say January, maybe December, if you can get them, pretty quickly, they can have an interim or like a preliminary action plan they can recommend to you by the late spring, summer, like that your June meeting. And that's really powerful to go in hand with your particular work as well. They can also give you some input on your equity statement. So I think that go back to where you talked about your statement, let this group be a part of that. And one way that they can help you is they can actually be hosts of listening sessions, right? So the equity, you can say the equity committee for Jefferson is going to be hosting student listening sessions, community listening sessions, very similar to the one that I facilitated, right? They host that, and they're the ones who gather this data. There may be part of the panelists, there may be part of those, but one of the things you can do is have them actually be the host of those listening sessions so you can gather more voices. And I think that's really powerful. Go ahead, Tony.
Nicole, 2 things. I noticed that notes have not been taken on the nice organizing thing. So I'm going to start doing that now, but I just requested edit access from you. So I can also fill back in what we have talked about.
Okay.
If you would grant me that.
No worries. We're about to take a break and we can fix that, but I'm taking notes and I'll also type them in there. So don't worry too much about it. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, good.
We'll take care of it. No stress.
Okay, thanks.
And then last piece, so the process, right? So a lot of people are like, hey, what does the process look like? So literally, if you imagine they have monthly meetings, right? They come together monthly, that they actually work in what we call subcommittees. So they actually do break up during that time and go into like subcommittees. I can envision 3, maybe 4, but anything beyond that is way too much because they're not going to be able to do that much anyway. And then quarterly updates. If you can imagine that they come to you and they have, their presenters and they come to you, here's an update from the equity committee. So the board knows what's going on. The board can also be a part of that to some degree, where you have a couple of board members, to not violate the Brown Act, but you have maybe you rotate, like sometimes that's nice so each board member can know. And you actually go to those meetings and you observe, and maybe you give input every once in a while, but you really kind of stand back and watch them do the work. But it's nice for board members to be able to see what's going on. And sometimes a rotation is helpful. I like that better than just the same board members coming each time. But it all depends on how that works, or what the culture is for you as a board. And then the other piece is building capacity and content knowledge. So I want to make sure you know that in order for this group to inform to give you recommendations based on this equity lens they have, that they need time to build an understanding of what equity is. Okay, so you got to make sure on those agendas that they have time to learn, what does equity mean? What is the definition of racism? Like, they need to know what this stuff is before they go and give you a recommendation and have no context. So that's why it's important to have that time on there. And it could be a variety of ways you do that. You usually don't have a lot of time, but through videos, like when I did the history of public education activity with them, that was the example, right? That was a content building moment. So they at least even know what they're going to be dealing with. And then the last piece, just again, is you got to make sure that there's always time to build brave and safe space for them. Because one of the things that I'm finding, especially with a lot of energy now, I have a lot of task force I get to work with, and there's a lot of energy from folks, right? But what happens is they still don't understand it has to be a safe space for people, because like we'll have parents as part of this, and parents will feel unsafe because they're like, I don't even know what education stuff is, let alone you're talking about equity and racism, right? So they don't feel they have a voice sometimes. They're not sure where to fit in. And then you'll have, you know, maybe you want to have a visitor who wants to come and be a part of it too. And maybe that visitor's perspective is just not the same as everyone else. So, you know, the relationships amongst the groups, you want to make sure that that's a safe space that's established for that group, because what you're asking of them is to be uncomfortable, right? You're asking them to give you insight on equity. And I tell you, even though they're passionate about it, it goes back to what I said earlier. People aren't always ready to take it deeper. So you got to make sure that that step is not skipped with them either. And so, you know, having icebreakers or letting them share their story is always powerful too. Tiffany, I want to let you jump in, because I know that we were talking a little bit about how, you know, leveraging an equity committee could be really helpful, but I was curious to hear your thoughts too about, you know, how this group could be helpful, and even in the work that you're doing, how it really aligns in many ways. So definitely feel free to jump in.
Thanks, Nicole. So I'm having a couple of thoughts. I think the first is the initial brainstorming we started to do around the equity committee. Like Tony, Kareen, Kaleem, and I met to talk about just putting all of this into context, right? Because like equity has been like a key theme in the district for, you know, how many years, like Kalima was saying, and it's like, where's the point where the action really starts to happen and really take root in the actual schools, the sites, like everything that people are doing. So that's not just a group of people, that's a committee that's holding that work, and, you know, the responsibility rests on them, but it's actually infused in people's roles. And so, and also taking in consideration the pandemic that we're in and how stressed people are right now to do anything beyond, you know, like just growing outside of their roles for teaching and leading and participating. And so one of the things that we talked about is, if we are going to, you know, reconvene this equity committee, what is going to be the expectations so that, you know, we don't, you know, push people beyond, and we continue to empower them, and we inform the systems that are perpetuating the inequities. Yeah. And so we talked about developing a like an equity lens for this committee to, one, learn about equity, and also create this kind of evaluation process or a list of questions that they could share with their teams. But I think it's going to be important for this board to, you know, with this equity statement that you all have developed and like put so much heart into, then also naming the exact, the issues that we're trying to address. Because I think if we don't name the historical inequities, like the why is still missing. The why of like what we're trying to accomplish with all of this work. Because I don't know if it's reasonable to have an equity committee who are made up of teachers and maybe a few district officials to have to, you know, implement HR policies or practices, versus the people who are actually in charge of HR policies and practices actually holding that and being responsible for that. But, you know, that mandate also has to come from the board, so that that's an expectation and people are held accountable to that, because there's so much power in this room, and I think we forget that sometimes. But just really being able to acknowledge that, you know, what are the expectations that we have of people in our district, and where does it, you know, like how can we distribute this work so it happens systemically and is operationalized.
Yeah, you know, Tiffany, you just said something that I really appreciate about like the setting the expectation, and then also like the staff kind of piece. It made me think about roles. And you're right, the committee is going to be made up of people who aren't necessarily going to be the decision makers, but they're going to weigh in on it. But also it is important that in this process that staff have clearly defined roles too, like expectations. So if you're going to have a focus area explicitly calling out, you know, hiring of diverse, staffing, and having culturally relevant professional development, like that's come up before. That could be a subcommittee, but making sure it's clear, like who is the staff, I call them liaisons, right? What staff person is gonna be connected so that that work aligns and that, you know, that group is informed, because you also don't wanna have that group say like, here's what we're gonna do, but yet they don't have context because they actually don't have that position and understand. So I think that's important. So So I don't know, thoughts about the group. It wasn't designed to go super deep, but just to give you kind of a sense of how you can use it. It should be encouraging to know you'll have a group of people who could help support some of the work you're rolling out. So that was really kind of the point of that piece. Any other questions or thoughts about that before you take a little break?
I think the other point of that is that to Tiffany's point about the expectations of them, I think we also need to talk about the commitment of the district, because a lot of these folks were disappointed because the group was really put to bed. It wasn't because of COVID.
Right. Okay.
It was just stopped. And so, and there was no explanation or rationale that was sent out to the group about why the meeting stopped.
Yeah.
They just stopped. So I think that when we bring the committee back together, like that needs to be addressed in the best way that we can.
Yep.
And also talk about that, you know, if they commit to, because they went through all the training, they went through all the learning, and before any of the actual work was going to start, it got
Got it. Okay.
Thank you, Kalima, because I just made the assumption that it was because of COVID. So I'm glad you called that out.
Yeah, I'll place that in the notes too, just communicating, I'll call it healing, right? Let's make sure we heal and just refocus the group so they understand the why, but powerful. Okay, well, let's do this. You all have been troopers, and we actually should have taken a break.
Nick has his hand up.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean.
Oh, sorry, I missed it. I apologize.
No, I was just going to add, I mean, like the group did stop at some point, and I think people in the district, obviously, through the spring and the summer, have had these conversations outside of the four walls, right, and any trainings and PDs. So continuing the conversation, because we've had a few since, obviously, more than a few. Just kind of being intentional, not just mindful, but intentional about encouraging people to join these committee meetings and at every site. I think that's really important, and even encouraging, I think, those who haven't spoken up as much, maybe to take that role. And there's always internal education to be done at site levels, professional development. But I think we need to prioritize people joining these conversations and feeling open in all the ways we're doing today. So I just want to say that.
Good point.
And then lastly, Mustafa is here, and I don't know if he had anything that he wanted to share before he went to break. He's our student trustee that has hung in there. We lost the other one.
No, I have nothing to add. I'm just, right now I'm kind of just listening, but my main concern is how do we get students involved? Because even in this meeting, it was 3, but now it's only me. And like, how do we present this in a way that students will get interested, because it actually does affect them, but how do we make that apparent to them?
Yeah, good point. Mustafa has a great point. One of the things that I forgot to offer to you all is using your study sessions, have a section that's just for student listening. And you have key guiding questions for them. And then, let them weigh in. And so utilizing your study sessions for kids to actually be a part of specific guiding questions that are just for the kids. I mean, obviously this is a study session for you as governance team, but actually utilize it as I call it a listening session. You actually can invite more kids to come, and we just have a listening session. You can actually, if you have the meeting platform set up, they can do breakout rooms too, which is always pretty powerful, just to listen and have them debrief and share. So that's something to think about, which I'm glad Mustafa shared that, because I think that's one way that it makes it more relevant for them, is to actually have a listening session just focus on hearing their voices too. So. All right. So President Salahuddin, would you like to allow us to take a break for a moment before we can regroup a little bit on the notes and agenda?
Sure. How long do you want to take? 5 minutes? 2 minutes? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? How long do people need? 10 minutes?
Looks like 5. Yeah, looks
Five
like
is
5.
good.
Okay.
5 is good. 5.
5. Okay, great. 5 minutes, guys.
All right,
A little
perfect.
bit.
And Tony, what I'll do, I think I gave you editing, right? So I'm just adding my notes in, but also I'll probably add the rest of them after the meeting, just because I can't get them all in, but no.
It's all good. I do have editing rights now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Together we will do it.
Yeah, no stress, okay? Because
Nope.
I'll be able to
All
put all
good.
of it in. So whatever you missed, don't worry about it.
Okay,
We'll be
good.
fine. You'll have your notes. So no worries.
Okay. Thanks. Take a break, Nicole.
Yeah, Tony, we're at 400s right now
Really? 1:30. How late's it going?
until 3.
3. Okay. COVID testing.
Oh, okay. I'm like, wait, we have what? So
Yeah.
one of the things I was going to share, I know Deborah and I had talked about the policy piece and also the content. So based on, we've had some really good discussion, but it's gone longer than we expected, which is fine. Like this is your study session. And there was a lot actually on the agenda, to be honest.
Yeah.
So what I was thinking about is we'll do a quick overview of the content that we want to go deeper in our last session, which is about the barriers to the work. And then what we can do is there was the article by Paul Gorski, which talked about racial equity detours, which I think would be a great kind of.
I think so.
Point. And it connects to the policy piece. So I'm not going to do a lot of content. I'm just going to kind of, here's where we're going, and we'll put that into our study session 4. That's okay.
I think that's good. I believe we're going to need more than 4 study sessions to get this work done.
I agree. Well, I said 4 is based on what we were, planning, but
I know
you're going to need more, so we can talk about how you, structure it, and whether
I
we're
think
here
that's
or not, you'll be fine.
I think it's good. I think everything has been really good and needed, so we'll get there.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick break.
Sounds good. All right, you there, Carla? All right, your baby's doing okay? Did she finish her assignment? Tiger Mom.
You know what? Y'all put the pressure on me, so I just like, I will do it later.
Oh,
I gave in to peer pressure. That was fun.
It's all good. Yeah, I was thinking, I had to go check and see what mine are doing, and they are awake. That's good. I thought they were.
Oh, that's well, you know,
till noon or whatever. But yeah,
it's the weekend. That's acceptable.
It is.
So it's
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into our last piece today. What I'm going to do is just give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover for session 4. You all had a great dialogue today, so we never want to rush that or cut that off. But we definitely want to make sure it's important we recognize the content building, like our awareness of what these concepts are, so that as you govern, you do have deeper understanding of this equity work. So one of the things that I want to do for you today is give you an overview of where we're going to go for next time. And I'm actually going to leave the slides in there for this session, even though we're not going to get through all of them, so that for those of you that want to go through and just kind of take a look, you're welcome to do so. But I want to just give you a quick overview, and then we're going to look at the Racial Equity Detours article as a reference to talk about your policy. Okay, so that's going to be what we'll do our last half hour. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen, as I said I would. And let's see. All right, so for session number 4, what we're going to go into is what we call the barriers to educational equity. So it's important that while you have a great equity statement, that you also recognize that there's a lot of things that get in the way of this work, because remember, swimming in this water called public education, it was never designed to be equitable. So that's when we did the history of public education, and that's in one of your former slides, but you're always welcome to, as a matter of fact, I will put this, I wonder if it's gonna let me. It won't let me in here. In a second, I'll put the history timeline in the chat for you if you want to go back to that again on your own time. But it's important to recognize the barriers to the work, because without that, you can't really create actions that are going to be equitable, because you'll stop the work because of the barriers, right? So we want to make sure we get ahead of the barriers versus being reactive. We want to be proactive. So that's the whole point of why we want to have content knowledge. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the cultural proficiency content to help you with that. Okay, and so cultural proficiency is just, as this piece talks about, it's like a way of being, it's an approach, it's a lens that enables you to respond effectively. The key word is respond effectively. Okay, that's where we want to go as a board. Okay, effectively. And again, and now we're going to start talking about culture. So when we say in a variety of cultural settings, what that means is that you all have a variety of constituents that you serve, students, parents, you name it. And in there, there's lots of different cultures. And so cultural settings means that you have spaces where people have different belief systems, different upbringing. It's not just about the boxes they check based on those demographics, right? We have to really think beyond that and think about these are different cultural nuances that exist, and we have to respond effectively to the issues that come with that, okay? Because you're gonna have people who are gonna have different opinions and different ways of seeing this work. And it goes back to the elephant and blind man, right? Those blind men are arguing about the elephant, and you're going to have us constantly be arguing about how do we get to be culturally proficient, where we value differences, we recognize the value of them, we recognize that there's going to be conflict, but we look at that as a good thing and not a bad thing. And again, we respond effectively. Now, one of the slides that is going to be used as a self-assessment, I want to share with you without much context right here. But I want to share with you the continuum. And this is where we're going to kind of help you think about where you're going on your journey. Because you're going to find that comments are going to be made, that actions are going to be taken by people, that there's going to be different ways to see this work. And the conflict that comes with that is because you have cultural differences. So the continuum is one of the pieces that we're going to share with you in session 4 to help you understand this work as a journey, okay? Not as it's right or wrong. Okay, that's going to be important. That's what creates barriers, is we have this whole, like, it's one way to do things and that's it, right? This is about a journey. And so what you'll see is this continuum shares healthy ways that we can respond to differences and recognize differences, which is kind of the right side of the continuum where you see 4, 5, 6. and then unhealthy ways that we respond and recognize differences. But in all of them, we recognize there's differences, right? There's no person who can say they're colorblind or culturally blind. The bottom line is we have been taught to be divisive, right? We've been taught that people are different, and we've been taught that that's wrong. So the continuum is going to help us think about where are we on our journey. And I'm going to ask you all to be thinking about where do you think Jefferson is, right, in its journey. And so I want you to think about cultural destruction, right, which is like the place we don't want to be. That's where we see we have different cultural nuances, but we stomp them out, right? We eliminate them. And those are things that happen. So you have to think about what does that look like in the governance space where we just don't even acknowledge or even value differences. Right, that's going to be important because someone's going to call us on this. The second one, culture and capacity. We notice we have different value systems, different cultural nuances, but we make them wrong. And a lot of times language is going to come up for this, where we have kids who don't speak the standard language, right, of English, and somehow they're always going to be thought of as wrong in the way that we respond. Okay, so that's important to think about. Okay, sometimes when interpretation comes up, this is going to happen, right, is that you don't speak English, so therefore we're not including you in this. Right? That's wrong, right? It means you're not speaking the right language. So thinking about that, right? The third one, which is where we're going to toggle back and forth, is cultural blindness, right? We see differences, but we act like we don't. You're going to hear people say, oh, I treat everybody the same. And, you know, I don't see differences. And that is actually on the unhealthy side of the continuum, because what that says is you don't see value in our culture to being different from yours. Okay, so I want you to be thinking about as we go through this process, we're going to want to be moving us on the journey of 4, 5, and 6, culturally pre-competent, which is I see the difference, but I still respond inadequately. So as a board, this is where you're probably going to fall at times, or you're going to be like, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to put ethnic studies in place. We're going to do this, do that. And then you're still going to respond, and it may still offend people. It still may not land right, but your intentions are right. Okay, and so that's important to recognize that it's okay that we might make a mistake, but we still are going to understand we got work to do because we're missing some information. This is why you have equity committees. This is why you have listening sessions. This is why you have more information to gather so that you can value cultural differences. So 5 is where you understand differences, you see them, and you also recognize the value that difference makes, right? So cultural differences, I call them cultural conflict, is not a bad thing. Right, that's where emotionally we are strong here. We're emotionally intelligent, is that when people have a different way of seeing things, we value that. We bring them closer, we learn, so we can really make sense of how do we do this work together. So cultural competence is where we want to be as a board. But then ultimately the promised land is cultural proficiency, which was that first slide I shared, right? Is that we see differences and we value them, we recognize them, and we respond effectively in all cultural settings, right? Which is very difficult to do. That's why I call it the promised land, because you're always going to be learning. You're always going to be in a space of gaining more information and building your capacity. So that's a quick, like, drink from a water hose, a fire hose, right? Kind of version of cultural proficiency. But what we're going to do is help you unpack that so you can feel safe with the discomfort of knowing that cultural differences is going to come up for you as a board. And this is where the work may get very hard. Okay, this is where the detours come in, right? When we're still in this like 3 and 4 place on the continuum. So as you think about the little that you know about the continuum, the little that you know about cultural proficiency, some of you may have been exposed to this content. I want you to just take a guess, just for me to know, and then we're going to jump into our article. Where do you think you are as a board on the cultural proficiency continuum, just collectively? Where do you think you are? There's no right or wrong answer, but just where do you think you are collectively as a board on the cultural proficiency continuum, where you recognize differences and how you respond to differences? Where do you think? Just take a guess.
Sorry, were you calling me?
Who's that? Oh, sorry, I'm on.
I think that was Jake. Do you want us to answer you out loud, Nicole, or are we just doing this internally?
Nope, just shout it out. Just say 4, 5, 3, 2. Where are you at collectively as a board? What do you think, Tony?
I'm thinking we're probably around 4 or 5. Like, I think we probably just because, you know, we're new at it, right? So that's what I would think.
So Tony, you're cheating. There's always one in every group when I ask this. They try to pick 2.
Yeah,
or they try to go in the middle, right? No, it's all good. But I hear you saying about a 4, but I could see you saying we can sometimes be here, sometimes there, but I hear you saying about a 4, so that's fine. How many agree with Tony? Would you say you're about a 4?
Yeah, I would say we're about a 4.
About a
Yeah,
4?
we're about
Okay.
a 4.
Okay.
No, 5.
You think you're at a 5? Yeah.
I said because I think we have a tendency to be humble to the point where we're like, no, we got room for improvement. Let's go 3. We're 3.
Yeah, you're right, Nick. I can see
So
that.
really,
That's fair,
throw it out there.
That's fair. That's fair.
Let's ante up a little bit, right? Like, so
Yeah.
we're not perfect, right? We're not 6, unless like the promised land, right? And so I think that we can get there, obviously, but these are our newly inducted superintendent. So of course she's gonna leave room for improvement. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't want to be critical of you. No, I can see what you're saying though, Nick.
Although in fairness, I think to say that we bounce back and forth is probably realistic, because there are probably some topics where we actually do understand what that difference will be. And then there will be other times where we're just like, I didn't even realize I needed to ask that question that way, right? And even the way I'm looking at it, or the way one of us might be looking at it, is something that's probably not right, even though we're just missing something.
Yes, there you go. Very well said.
I will say we're number 5 because obviously we're not here on this Saturday to talk about this for no reason, right?
Damn, drop the mic up.
Right? So I would say we are proactively doing number 5. How about that?
No, I appreciate y'all saying that. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. The reason why I asked you this is because as we unpack this content, you're going to have to see where you are in your journey, right? So that we recognize the biggest barrier to this work is differences, right? Different experiences, different cultures, belief systems, that whole mental model we talk about, that's going to be the barrier, and how you respond to it is going to be what it is. That's it. That's so when the work stops, right? When the work gets hard, how do we respond? So this is going to be the content we're going to share going into session 4. And a lot of it we're going to do is actually going to be from what I call an inside out approach, from like, how do we fit on this continuum personally? And then how does it show up professionally for us too? I just appreciate that. Again, no right or wrong answers, just kind of throwing it out there. And so when we think about the barriers to this particular work, I want you to think about, obviously you're a governance team, so everything you do is based on policy, right? And so when we think about policy, I want you to think about, you have an amazing policy you adopted. That policy is going to govern where you move forward. But as we unpack that, I want to make some connections with the article. And I know Deborah has some great things to have you think about as you connect how we're going to do this work and not get detoured, right? Because of how sometimes policy doesn't drive our work. And some of the barriers that come with it. So Deborah, I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to you for a moment so that we can try to walk them through making connections to this policy piece of their work. And again, we're going to continue this in session 4. So don't feel like you all have to complete everything today, but this is really important to think about.
Absolutely. And the discussion has been such a rich discussion and such a necessary discussion. So I really commend the team for, going through all of this. I know you've been getting so much information from us, but this is so important to build your capacity to do this work. And so I had a chance to tell Nicole, like, this article is so spot on and aligns so much with what help board members when you already have your policy and you have your statement, even though it's the draft, things to look at. So the first thing that came to my mind in this article, it says about all of the detours, okay? They create an illusion of progress toward equity while cementing or even exacerbating inequity. So you think about all these things everyone's doing, but are you really focusing on the work? And so in this article, of course, it talks about initiatives and the framework and how it will mask racial inequities. So I really like how it highlights really 4 of the racial detours. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but just there's one specifically I want to share with you. Of course, the first one is pacing for privilege. You know, the professional development in the schools appeared designed to accommodate the feelings and fears of white educators. You know, and again, we have to call it what it is. And again, this is not to offend anyone, but we have to call it what it is. Okay. And then poverty of culture, as if, again, we blame students for being poor. You know, kids being poor is not a disability, you know, and we can't treat children like that. That's a circumstance that they're in, that their parents in, because they're not the ones making the money, you know, bringing any income. So the third one, though, deficient ideology detour. That is a key one, because are we trying to fix students? And so when you're looking at your policy, if you keep that in mind, our policy, we have things stated in there that we're trying to fix students, you know, instead of looking at who students are and the diversity they bring to the table. And again, focusing on equity, giving them what they need. But sometimes as adults, we try to create something to fix the students instead of who's ever teaching the student or the curriculum that's being provided to them. So that is so key. So really keeping this article close to you and connecting it when you're looking at your policy is so important. And so looking at your policy, well, before I share one piece, I want you to think about, because I read over your policy and I know it's a template that you have adopted from CSBA, and that is a great start. But the next step, of course, is you have to customize it to what is good for your district. Okay. And you've already started having the statement, and it's still a draft, but 3 areas I want you to think about. And when we look at this, can you find this in your equity policy? So your equity policy should commit the school board to ensuring that the principles of fairness, equity, and inclusion are fully integrated through all of your policies, your programs, operations, and your practicing guiding the students. You have to make sure everyone gets an assignment. So that's for the school board. Okay, now the superintendent. The superintendent actually develops, you know, a plan. Remember the how, with a clear and measurable accountability standards and procedures to be shared with the public and submitted to the board annually for approval. So that's an assignment for the superintendent. Okay, and of course your equity should be reviewed for implementation of the plan by all of your district's departments. Again, this is making sure that everyone has buy-in, that everyone has their finger, they can see where they fit in. And then the third one is the equity policy should obligate the district as a whole to eliminate any policies, structures, and practices that perpetuates inequities and contribute to the disproportionality of access and income and outcomes. And your policy should call for equitable distribution. And so it's not just finance, it's human capital. And that should be shown throughout your budget. So I always like to share with board members on if you focus on those areas, because we can get caught up in a lot of the language describing equity. And that's fine too, so that everybody is clear. But where's the implementation is going to come? Who's responsible for what? And so when we look at your statement, again, being a draft, you know, taking it line for line again to see how it aligns with your priorities. Are you inclusive of everyone in your district? I know I read some comments on one of your notes about adding different language, indigenous people, you know, students. So again, I know you're going through this to continue to tweak it, but making sure you go line by line and align it with what are we saying our priorities, the buckets? Because remember, there are so many areas of equity that a Board of Education can focus on. But if you look at the umbrella, if 3 or 4 is plenty to work on, okay? So you don't want to have so many going that you don't complete anything. And so your 4 priorities, again, making sure that they're different from your hot topics. Hot topics are going to continue to be there on the outside, but you're staying, making sure that you're focused. So you're saying your budget, the human resources, the community climate, and the teaching and learning. Does this show up in our equity statement? And so just based upon how I connected the article and the comments I made about the board having a responsibility, the superintendent, and then the district as a whole, what do you see? Do you see that in your equity, just your equity statement? We'll start there. Does anybody just jump in?
I'll jump in. I think with our equity statement, we went for more general approach. I feel like so we didn't get into the more specifics and some of the things that we wanted to. So that's just my recollection of it, but we should a little bit more, at least with reference to some things. And I think maybe we can explore that today.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anyone else have any comments?
What I'm going to do.
I know you're still digesting, pulling this in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say what I'm gonna do for the sake of just a visual, because I'm a visual person, I'm gonna put that one slide back up with their priorities. I think that might help.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good to have in front.
Deborah, I'm going to admit that my brain, that I was trying to take notes, I was trying to listen, and I'm just tired. So will you please repeat what it is that you're asking?
I am asking you to, based upon what I shared about responsibilities, making sure that the board has a responsibility, the superintendent and the district as a whole. And then you have your 4 buckets, as we will call your priorities. When you have an equity statement, do all of those things show up in your statement? And then it filters down in detail in your equity policy. Okay. So that's what I want you to look. I know that this is a template, but I'm just sharing things that you have to start thinking about, because now the work is customizing it to your district. Because this is a framework of an equity policy, is a great start. Of course, you have your vision, your philosophy. That's all the other language that goes in there. But what does all of that have to do with your priorities that you're saying that you're going to connect with equity? Okay.
So I'll speak. So
go ahead.
I think our equity statement is very inclusive of what we want to do. Because like when we're talking about indigenous groups and other ethnic or racial groups, we're talking about current or historic inequities, and that we need to examine and understand how our decision-making process reinforces or interrupts the injustice that's been done to those communities. So I think that's handled right there. I think when we're talking about, again, we're talking about embracing inclusion and valuing diversity. Again, that talks about a lot of the stuff that we spoke about into the, that were kind of key things that were important to us. Especially, you know, one of the things is like ethnic studies and the study of ourselves. That's valuing the diversity and respecting all viewpoints. I mean, one of the problems with our curriculum right now is it's only one viewpoint. So we can't have a curriculum that's only one viewpoint and say in our statement that we respect all viewpoints. And I think in another piece that we really needed, that I think is one of the key parts of our statement that I'm really proud of, is talking about, we have to dismantle the systemic inequities to bring about a more just society. And I think that's the piece that's really critical to this work, because we do have to dismantle a lot of the systems right now that are happening in education and build them back up. And that's a really uncomfortable, hard, challenging things to do, because a lot of the people, the system as it currently is working. When we talk about whys, that's what we can point to.
Yeah, and I so appreciate you saying that. I was going to circle back to that, because the key thing is, this is where the work of the board really resides too. What are you going to do once you determine the inequities? Now, what are you going to do? So what does the dismantling look like? We have to make sure we look at all of our other policies. You have ethnic policies, you have harassment, other discipline, but this is equity. But how will those other policies impact this particular one? And so that's where you have to start putting things next to each other. And again, your statement is always, we said, this is your what. This is what we said, who we are. This is what we are. So we can't have any policies in place that contradict this. We can't have any practices in place that contradict this word. And you're right, Kaleem. I just wanted you guys to be able to articulate this, because the more you say what your statement is, it's going to be more, reside more in you. You'll keep thinking about it. So that goes to almost at the beginning when Nicole was asking you, what is equity? What's your elevator speech? To be able to say, yes, this, because this is your statement. So what I'm sharing with you, because it's the big picture before, even though you have this, the equity policy, the work, there's still a lot of work, as you know, and now you take piece by piece and making sure that based upon your statement, what does it mean when we talk about the salary disparities on the budget and the professional development, the inequitable? Usually we focus on teaching staff discipline. These are things that everybody can see. But what are these other things, the rigor, the grading, family engagement? How is that going to show up in your equity policy? And that's why, again, all of this connects to you having, I was so pleased to hear about the equity committee, because again, you guys don't have all the answers. And in order to have, and I really hate to keep saying community input, because it's so much more than that. Because input could be like, yeah, I like what they're doing, but we really want people to really be involved, engaged. And so in order to have that engagement at that level, having that committee will support this work. But what the board is going to be responsible for, of course, is to gather that information and make sure that when you're reading your equity policy, as you're doing every section, how is this aligning with what we said we are doing? And does your vision statement align with your equity statement? The philosophy, and again, these are the languages that you can have fillers in this equity policy. But now, what does it mean to Jefferson Union High School? What equity means here? What's the part that the student's role going to be? I would even add that to it, not just saying the district, that what's the student's responsibility? Because there is a student portion in there that we need to have student voice. So putting your equity policy together, is there a voice of students in there? And this is what we have to be careful about. And that's why I'm just sharing with you the big picture of how to put together an equity policy, even though you have this, now putting meat on the bones, if you will, making sure you have your principles, your guiding principle, of course, your goals. What are your equity goals? And then how are we going to monitor and evaluate this work? Because again, it needs to be evaluated continuously. Many of the boards that I work with who put their equity policy together, if you look at that last page, where you always put the update, whatever you adopted, it's every single year. Something changes because again, you are personalizing it to your district. And so there will be instances or things that will come up that you didn't address. This is the time to do it. That's why putting an equity policy together, you take steps to do this. You guys done the work right here to say what your priority is, what you're going to focus on now. And I think it will help, like Nicole mentioned, having study sessions for each of these quadrants. And then how does that flow in through our statement and into an equity policy? So again, when someone reads our equity policy and want to challenge us on what we said we were going to do under the budget area, is it clear in your policy? Your human resources, is it clear? Because again, this is going to be public information. And if someone really is thinking that you are not doing the work that you said you're going to do, this is where they're going to call you out on it. So how detailed and specific are you going to be, you know, in putting your policy together? And so just thinking about that, the work is really starting now. But I think having the committee and doing your study groups and taking the information from those study groups, study sessions, and then, you know, pulling that into your equity policy. And it will cover all of the areas that you've identified. That's your priorities. These are your priorities. Because again, you can't do everything that's coming up, but stay focused in this area so that everyone from the staff, students, community, board, everyone will play a role. Everyone will see how they are engaged at every level here. So, you know, the work, you know, and I know we've talked about so much, but this is all to build you up. This, of course, this was not going to be we were going to put your equity policy together right now. We are still building up to that. And I know, you know, you're in information overload right now, but just big picture wise, just always think about now that we have articulated our focus areas. Now, how does it show up through the statement? Because everything has to come through. That's that SMART, you know, the SMART goals. And I think, Nick, you brought that up too. I love to bring that example. If it can't pass the SMART test, you shouldn't be doing it. Because you can't measure it. It's not relevant. It's not timely. It's not specific. And is, you know, all of that. It's not attainable. So keeping that in mind as the filter will help you build a very powerful equity statement that your staffing will be able to say, I know exactly what my charge is to do. When I'm in my classroom, when I'm at the principals' meetings or the teachers' meeting, this is what we're going to do. We're clear. All of that has to come from the Board of Education because the board sets the direction for the district. That is no different when you're trying to do the policy. This is still, you know, developing the structure in which you are going to lead. And so that everyone from your superintendent and her staff has to be clear. What is, you don't ever want them to say, what does the board want us to do? You know, so if those questions come up, then that's where you kind of peel back a little bit and say, okay, they don't see how they're involved in this. Okay. And so I know we're getting to the end, and I know, Tony, you wanted to share something, but that's the big picture of it. And I know we have only one more session, then we are really going to have to dissect these areas and how they filter through your statement and then land up in a policy. And I wanted to share that part with you before I will also drop into the folder some very, very good and very informative policies that other districts have put together, because you do not have to recreate the wheel. You don't. And so I will put some samples, but I didn't want you to see the samples first, but I will make sure you see that. And these policies are doing exactly what the community wanted it to do. They understand it. And so I think that will be very helpful. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over so that, Tony, you can share what you needed to, and then Nicole, and then Kalima, if you want, and close it out. But that's just the big picture structure that I'm always going to share from you through the lens of governance. Everything I talk about is through the lens. That's I don't know how to do anything else. That's what I do with boards because I care that much about your success.
Awesome. Thank you, Deborah. I'm hearing myself on somebody's echo. I wanted to bring up a topic, but it is 2:14, and I don't think we have time, but I'm glad that we spent the time on what we did. I wanted to bring up a topic about a student survey and get some input on it, and specifically because Mustafa's here. But I'm thinking that we may just need to set up another hour to do that at another time. So Tiffany, sure, it was less about what questions were, but how to do it. So yes, I will communicate with you guys on that just outside of here. So I'm just going to leave it at that and say thank you. If that's okay with you, Kalima and Rosie, I know we were hoping to address it today. Is that okay with you? I just think it might take, I know I need to leave pretty soon, and I think.
No worries. If we don't have the time, we don't have the time.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, very good. Thank you so much. That's it for me. I got a lot out of today, so thank you.
So can I offer one thing for you all to rest and know, like, kind of next steps? I know we'll plan for session number 4, and we'll continue with the work. And what I will do in collaboration with Deborah, she has a bunch of samples to consider. But I've been going through your policy like since we first started it, and I feel like on our next session, if you would like, I can share, now that you have your statement, you have your priorities, that we can share some recommendations for how you may want to revise it and just kind of reorganize it is how I see it, and just go make it more for you. And so with your permission, I'll share that for your next study session so that you all can wrestle with it a little bit. And but you go through it yourselves. I think you're going to have to do that so it makes sense to you in your brain. And you have a lot of information that you have to consider for that. So I'll, I guess, connect with you all offline about next steps in terms of the dates. And Tiffany, definitely we can connect about the equity committee and all the work you're doing so we can be aligned for this wonderful board we get to support, and new superintendent. And Mustafa, thank you for your time and energy today and hearing us grown-ups talk about all these great things on behalf of students. Just super excited, and we're here because of you. So thank you, Mustafa.
Problem. It was a very informative meeting.
All right, so I'm just gonna wrap this up. I know folks gotta go, so I won't keep folks too long. Thanks everyone for spending a Saturday. And I'll see everybody soon. If I don't talk to you beforehand, have a fantastic Thanksgiving. Hopefully a restful break next week.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Everyone stay safe.
Care, everybody.
Happy week of giving, y'all.
Stay safe.
All right. Bye, Nicole. We'll connect offline.
Okay, sounds good.
Have a good one.
Tony,
Bye-bye.
Tony, I'll go ahead and update the minutes for you, and then you can add whatever you need that I forgot. I don't remember when you all called.